Eleanor Whitfield pressed her hands flat against the kitchen table and told herself she would not cry, not today, not with him standing in the next room. Her sisters were laughing too loudly, their voices carrying through the walls like a performance she had memorized and never been cast in. She could hear her father pacing. She could hear the stranger's boots on the floorboards, slow, deliberate, a man who had learned to move like someone who expected the ground to shift beneath him. She poured the tea and walked toward the door. If this story speaks to something you felt before, overlooked, underestimated, quietly holding everything together, subscribe to this channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Jonathan Whitfield read it 3 times before he set it down on the breakfast table, and even then his hands wouldn't quite stop trembling. He was a man who had spent the better part of 4 years watching everything he owned slowly disappear. First, the northern fields sold to cover a debt he hadn't fully understood when he signed the papers. Then the livestock, then the silver that his wife had brought to the marriage from her own family, the Hargroves of Philadelphia, who would have been furious to know where it had ended up. The horses were nearly gone. The servants had been reduced to 4. And the estate itself, which his grandfather had built on land that once seemed inexhaustible, was now carrying a mortgage that Jonathan could not pay, and could not refinance, and could not by any honest means escape. The letter was from a man named Nathaniel Ashcroft. The name meant something in New York. It meant something the way certain weather meant something, a name that came before the man, the way a cold front came before a storm. Ashcroft had inherited his father's lands at 22 and doubled them by 30. He had served as an officer in the War of 1812 and come back from it with a slight injury to his left leg and a reputation for being the kind of man who did not waste words or sentiment on anything that didn't deserve them. He was 32 now. He had no wife. He had, according to the letter, made a decision. He was prepared to consider a marriage arrangement. He had heard of the Whitfield daughters through a mutual acquaintance, whose name he declined to mention in the letter, which Jonathan found both suspicious and irrelevant, because by the time he reached the second paragraph, the only thing that mattered was the figure mentioned near the bottom of the page, a settlement that would clear the Whitfield debt in full, with enough remaining to restore the estate, and provide each daughter with a modest annual income regardless of which one he chose. Jonathan folded the letter and called for his daughters. Caroline arrived first. She always did. She had a way of moving through a room that suggested she had been expecting to be summoned, and she arranged herself in the parlor chair with the kind of effortless elegance that Jonathan had always privately suspected took considerable effort. She was 24, the eldest, and she had spent the last 2 years positioning herself for exactly this kind of opportunity, attending every gathering within riding distance, cultivating acquaintances in Albany and New York City, practicing the precise art of being admired without appearing to seek it. "Who's the letter from?" she asked before Jonathan had said a word. "A man named Nathaniel Ashcroft." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Caroline's posture shifted barely just enough. "Ashcroft," she repeated. "The landowner, the one up the river." "The same." Rebecca came in behind her, already carrying a book, already wearing the expression she wore when she considered herself to have been interrupted from something more important. She was 22, the middle daughter, and she had the kind of intelligence that she had never quite figured out how to make charming. She set the book face down on the side table and looked between her father and her sister. "What's happened?" Eleanor was last. She had been in the kitchen as she usually was at that hour, reviewing the week's accounts with Mrs. Hadley, the housekeeper, because someone had to, and it had long since stopped being a question of whose job it was. She came in wiping her hands on a cloth and stood near the door, not taking a seat, because there were only 2 chairs and her sisters were already occupying them. Jonathan told them everything. What followed was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds before Caroline broke it. "He's coming here when Friday. That's 3 days. I'm aware, Caroline. 3 days is not enough time to—" She stopped herself. Recalibrated, began again with a slightly different angle. "We'll need to prepare properly. The east parlor needs to be aired, and we should consider what we'll wear, what we'll discuss." She was already making a list behind her eyes. Eleanor could see it. Father, does he have any known preferences, conversation topics? I've heard he served at the Niagara frontier. I could speak to that. I don't know his preferences, Jonathan said. I know he's coming. Rebecca had been quiet, which for Rebecca meant she was thinking, and the thinking hadn't finished yet. Ashcroft, she said finally. I've read his name in the Albany Gazette. He testified before the state legislature last year regarding the river trade disputes. He was described as, and I'm quoting, unusually direct for a man of his standing. She said it like a verdict. I can speak to the trade disputes. I've read all the relevant papers. Very good, Jonathan said, with the slightly desperate encouragement of a man who needed all three of his daughters at their absolute best, and was not certain he had three daughters at their absolute best. Nobody asked Eleanor what she thought. Eleanor didn't offer it. She went back to the kitchen and told Mrs. Hadley they should plan for a formal dinner on Friday evening, and would Mrs. Hadley please check whether they had enough good candles and what was the state of the tea service, because if they were going to make any impression at all, it would help to not serve a man like Nathaniel Ashcroft from a cracked pot. The next 3 days were in Eleanor's experience among the more exhausting of her life, and she had not been asked to do anything different from what she always did. She simply did more of it, and faster, and with less help, because Caroline and Rebecca had both developed a sudden inability to engage with any domestic task that might be visible from the front of the house. Caroline practiced her entrance. Twice Eleanor passed the hallway and heard her eldest sister working on the precise way she would cross a room, the angle of her chin, the placement of her hands, the speed of her step, slow enough to be graceful, quick enough to appear purposeful. It was, Eleanor thought, not entirely unlike watching someone rehearse a play in which only they knew they were the lead. Rebecca read. She read everything she could locate regarding Nathaniel Ashcroft, the War of 1812, the Hudson River Valley land, disputes the state of New York agricultural policy, and at least 2 separate treatises on military strategy, which she announced at dinner on Thursday, would give her something substantive to discuss with a man of his background. Men of his background, Caroline said without looking up from her needlework, don't necessarily want to discuss military strategy over dinner. Men of intelligence discuss what's worth discussing, Rebecca replied. I'd rather be remembered as interesting than decorative. You might try being both. Eleanor refilled the water pitcher and said nothing. Jonathan spent the 3 days managing his anxiety with varying degrees of success. He walked the length of the house several times each morning, checking windows, inspecting furniture, moving things that didn't need moving, and moving them back. On Thursday night, he found Eleanor in the kitchen, near midnight, writing out the dinner menu for the following evening in her careful, even handwriting, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke. Eleanor. She looked up. Father. Tomorrow. He stopped. Started again. I need you to understand the importance of this. What Ashcroft is offering, would change everything for us, for all of us. I know, she said. Your sisters. He hesitated. Your sisters they're prepared. They're very capable women. I think he'll be impressed. I think so too, Eleanor said. Something moved across his face that might have been guilt and might have been relief that she wasn't going to make this harder for him. I need you to be helpful tomorrow, available, for whatever is needed. Of course, she said. And stay out of the way where you can. Let your sisters... He stopped again. You understand? I do, Eleanor said. She looked back down at her menu. She wrote tea service 4 o'clock strong, no sugar. She didn't know yet why she wrote that last part. She just knew it felt right. Nathaniel Ashcroft arrived on Friday at 2:30 in the afternoon, and he arrived in the middle of a summer downpour. Eleanor saw him from the kitchen window. First, a single rider, no carriage, just a man on a dark horse coming up the drive at a steady pace, as if the rain were a matter of no particular interest. He was wearing a dark coat that had gone gray with water and a hat pulled low, and he moved with the kind of deliberate unhurriedness that Eleanor had only ever seen in men who had stopped worrying about what other people thought of them. He handed his horse to the stable boy without ceremony. He stood at the front door and removed his hat and shook the water from it, then handed his coat to the housemaid, who opened the door and said something Eleanor couldn't hear from where she was standing. But the housemaid, 16-year-old Patsy, who was afraid of almost everything, straightened up and said something back with what looked like actual confidence. Eleanor noted that. She finished arranging the tray and went to take her position near the back of the east parlor, which was where her father had told her to be. Available. Helpful. Out of the way. The introductions were already underway when she slipped in through the side door. "So honored to welcome you, Mr. Ashcroft. Truly, the journey must have been terrible in this weather. Please sit. My daughters have been so looking forward." Jonathan's voice had a particular quality when he was frightened. A brightness that was slightly too bright, and Eleanor heard it now and felt the familiar ache of knowing there was nothing she could do about it. She looked at Nathaniel Ashcroft. How was taller than she'd expected. Broad in the shoulders, in a way that had less to do with size than with how he held himself, someone who was used to carrying weight and had stopped noticing it. His face was lean and weathered, and he had dark eyes that were moving around the room with the steady, systematic attention of someone doing a reconnaissance, which Eleanor supposed, given his history, was exactly what it was. How was also, she realized, in some pain. It was in the way he'd angled himself when he sat, not quite putting his full weight on the left side, keeping his left leg slightly extended. The War of 1812 injury mentioned in the Gazette. He wouldn't want it noticed. Caroline was already moving into position, and Eleanor had to admit entirely without resentment that Caroline was extraordinary at this. She had the kind of beauty that operated like a weather system. It preceded her, altered the atmosphere, made men lean forward slightly without realizing they'd moved. She extended her hand and smiled at Nathaniel Ashcroft with precisely the right combination of warmth and composure, and she said, "Mr. Ashcroft, we're so glad the weather didn't discourage you." And it was objectively a perfect opening. Nathaniel Ashcroft looked at her hand, shook it once, and said, "Miss Whitfield." Then he looked past her. Not rudely, not dismissively. Just past her briefly, as if something had caught his attention in his peripheral vision. And then his eyes came back to Caroline, and he was attentive enough, polite enough, entirely correct in his manner. But Eleanor had seen it. That half-second of looking elsewhere. She wondered what he'd been looking for. Rebecca stepped forward next and launched with admirable directness into a question about his legislative testimony regarding the river trade disputes, which clearly surprised him. His eyebrows lifted slightly, a fractional movement, gone almost immediately, and they spoke for perhaps 10 minutes on a subject that excluded everyone else in the room, including Caroline, who maintained her expression with iron discipline. Rebecca was sharp and well-informed, and she held his attention genuinely, which Eleanor could tell because his responses grew slightly longer, slightly more engaged. But there was something else there too. A quality to how he sat and answered, something slightly performative in its patience, like a man who had learned to be attentive through practice rather than inclination. Jonathan called for tea. Eleanor moved to the table and began to pour. She poured Caroline's cup first because that was correct, then Rebecca's, then her father's. She was reaching for the fourth cup for Nathaniel Ashcroft, who was currently listening to Caroline explain with extraordinary charm the particular social pleasures of the Albany season, and she stopped. She looked at the tea. She thought about what she'd written on the menu the night before. Strong. No sugar. She thought about a man who had ridden through a rainstorm alone when he could have come by carriage with attendants. Who had spoken kindly to a frightened housemaid. Who was sitting slightly wrong to hide an old wound. Who listened to everything with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust appearances. She poured his cup strong the way she'd said. She did not add sugar. She added nothing. She set it on the saucer and carried it across the room and placed it on the small table at his right hand without interrupting the conversation. He glanced down at it. He lifted it. He took one sip. And he stilled just for a moment, just long enough that it meant something. And then he set the cup down and looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at Eleanor, which was to say, not with any particular focused attention at all. He looked at her the way he'd been looking around the room since he arrived, like he was taking inventory of something that mattered. "Did I ask for sugar?" he said. "No, sir," Eleanor said. "Did your father tell you how I take my tea?" "No, sir." A pause. Around them, the room was still making noise. Caroline had transitioned elegantly to asking about Ashcroft Manor. Rebecca had retrieved her book and was making a point about something, but Nathaniel Ashcroft had apparently stopped tracking any of it. "Then how did you know?" he said. Eleanor met his eyes. She had learned over the course of her 20 years to speak carefully in rooms where she was not supposed to be noticed, which generally meant speaking with precision, because imprecision took up more space, and space was not something she was allocated. "You rode here in the rain," she said. "Alone. You didn't stop to change your coat when you arrived, which means comfort isn't what you came for. Your leg's bothering you, but you haven't mentioned it, which means you don't want it made into a point of conversation. A man like that doesn't want sweetness added to things that are fine without it." The silence that followed was perhaps 3 seconds long. "A man like that," Nathaniel Ashcroft repeated very quietly, as if he was tasting the phrase. "I could be wrong," Eleanor said. "You're not," he said. He picked up the cup again. He drank. And then, for the first time since he'd walked into the east parlor, the set of his jaw changed. Not quite a smile. Nothing so uncomplicated as that, but a lessening of something. A weight he'd been carrying since the door put down for just a moment. Eleanor took a step back. She returned to her place near the side table. She did not look at him again, but she felt him looking at her. The dinner proceeded according to the plan Jonathan had constructed, which meant Caroline anchored the conversation with elegance, and Rebecca provided intellectual ballast, and Eleanor refilled things, and cleared things, and responded when directly addressed, and mostly went unaddressed. It was a performance that had been running for several years in the Whitfield household, and all 3 daughters knew their roles with the fluency of long practice. Nathaniel Ashcroft ate steadily, and said little, and watched everything. After dessert, when Jonathan had begun steering the conversation toward the pleasant topic of the Ashcroft estate and its prospects, Nathaniel set down his fork and looked at Eleanor. "Miss—" He paused. He didn't know her name. She realized with a small shock that in the introductions she had not been introduced. She had simply been there the way the furniture was there. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Whitfield. Miss Eleanor." He said it like he was noting it down somewhere. "If you lived on an isolated estate far from Albany, far from any city, how would you spend your days?" The table went very quiet. Caroline's smile stayed perfectly in place, which Eleanor knew from experience meant she was furious. Rebecca put down her fork. Jonathan opened his mouth and then closed it again. Eleanor considered the question. She did not consider how she ought to answer it, or what would sound most appealing, or what a man like Nathaniel Ashcroft was looking for. She just considered it honestly the way she would have if he'd asked her in an empty room with no consequences attached. "I'd walk in the mornings," she said, "early before the heat. I'd keep the accounts. I'd want to know the real state of things, not a managed version of them. I'd read in the afternoons when the work allowed it. I'd talk to the staff. I'd learn what the estate needed from the people who already knew it." She paused. "I'd make sure the tea was ready before it was asked for." The last thing she said without quite meaning to, and she almost took it back, but she didn't. Nathaniel Ashcroft was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the most honest answer I've heard today." "It's the only kind I know how to give," Eleanor said. He nodded once. He looked at Jonathan, and then he said words that, judging by the sound her father made a small strangled exhale, nobody in the room had predicted. "Mr. Whitfield," Nathaniel Ashcroft said, "I should like to speak with Miss Eleanor tomorrow morning if you'll permit it. I find I have a few more questions." "Sure." Jonathan came to Eleanor's room that night at 9:30. He knocked, which he didn't usually do, and she said, "Come in," and he stood in the doorway holding the candle at an angle that threw strange shadows across his face and made him look just for a moment like the version of himself she remembered from her childhood, the one who had not yet learned what failure felt like from the inside. "He asked for you specifically," Jonathan said. "I know," Eleanor said. She was sitting at the small desk beneath the window, and she turned in her chair to face him, but didn't stand. "Caroline is—" He stopped. "And Rebecca—" "I know," Eleanor said again. If this goes the way it seems like it might go." He was struggling with something. She watched him struggle with it and waited. "Eleanor, is this something you could accept?" Eleanor thought about a man who rode through rain alone and didn't complain about his leg, and drank his tea without sugar, and asked her an honest question, and listened to the answer. "Yes," she said. "I think I could." Jonathan's exhale was long and complicated. "Good," he said. "Good." He stood there another moment. "You should sleep," he said finally, which was not what he meant, and they both knew it, and neither said so. After he left, Eleanor sat at her desk for a long time. She was not thinking about Ashcroft Manor, or the debt, or what her sisters would say in the morning. She was thinking about that moment. The cup lifted, the stillness, the look. The sensation of being seen by someone who did not see her by accident or obligation, but by choice. She had spent 20 years becoming invisible. She had not expected it to be the thing that made her visible. The morning conversation took place on the east side of the house, where there was a bench under a tree that got morning shade, and Jonathan permitted it in the sense that he arranged for them to be not quite chaperoned, which was its own kind of permission in 1817. Nathaniel Ashcroft arrived before she did. He was already sitting when she came around the corner of the house, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. He looked up when he heard her footsteps and stopped turning the hat. "Miss Eleanor," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, and sat on the far end of the bench, which was proper, and folded her hands in her lap, which was practical. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't try to fill it. "I'm going to speak plainly," he said. "I hope that suits you." "Better than the alternative," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement. Something more considered than that. "I have a large estate. It runs well when it's managed properly and falls apart when it isn't, and I've been managing it by myself for 4 years, which means it's been running somewhere between those two states, depending on the season." He looked at the hat. "I need a wife. I'm not going to pretend this is something it isn't. I'm looking for the partner. Someone who can run a house, handle accounts, deal with staff, make decisions when I'm not there to make them." He paused. "I'm not offering romance, Miss Eleanor. I don't know how to be that kind of man, and I think honesty about that matters more than pretending otherwise." "I agree," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "You agree?" "About the honesty. I think pretending otherwise is how people end up unhappy." Another pause. "What are you looking for?" he said. Nobody had asked her that. Not once in any conversation about her future that she'd ever been party to had anyone thought to ask her that. "Safety," she said. "Stability. Work that matters. Somewhere I'm not." She stopped, chose more carefully. "Somewhere that needs what I actually have to offer." "And what's that?" he said. "I can run a house," she said. "I can read accounts and find where money's going wrong. I can manage staff fairly. I can solve problems quietly before they become crises. I can—" She stopped again. "I can make sure the tea is ready before it's asked for." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." The morning light was coming through the leaves above them in shifting patterns, and somewhere behind the house, Eleanor could hear Patsy the housemaid singing something off-key, and the sound of a cart on the road, and the ordinary noise of a summer morning in the Hudson River Valley, continuing without any awareness of the extraordinary thing that was happening on the bench beneath the tree. "I'll speak to your father this afternoon," Nathaniel Ashcroft said. Eleanor nodded. "Miss Eleanor." He said it like a question. "Mr. Ashcroft." "Is there anything you want to ask me?" She thought about it. She had a list somewhere in the back of her mind. Questions about the estate, the staff, the accounts, the nature of the legal disputes. He was managing the condition of the house itself. But those weren't the questions he was really asking about. "Your leg," she said. "Is it going to get better, or is it something you manage?" He blinked. It was the first fully surprised expression she'd seen on him. "Manage," he said after a moment. "All right," she said. "Then I'll learn what helps." The silence that followed was different from the other silences. It was the kind of silence that meant something had been decided, not by any single word, but by the accumulation of everything that had been said and left unsaid, and would be figured out later in the steady way that things got figured out between two practical people who had both in their different ways given up on fairy tales. Nathaniel Ashcroft put his hat back on. "I'll speak to your father," he said again. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'll make sure the tea is ready." She was in the kitchen when Caroline found her. She heard her sister before she saw her the particular quality of Caroline's footsteps when she was containing something large and sharp, a precision to each step that meant she was choosing not to move faster. "He asked for you," Caroline said. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, and she was holding herself very still, which was the thing Caroline did instead of showing what she felt. "Yes," Eleanor said. She was measuring out the tea leaves and she didn't stop. "Father told me what he said. A breath. He's going to offer for you." "It seems so." "Eleanor." The stillness cracked just slightly. "You didn't do anything. You just poured the tea." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's not—" Caroline stopped. "You didn't try. You didn't even—" "No." Eleanor agreed. "That's not fair," Caroline said, and for just a moment she sounded not like the elegant, composed, calculating woman she had become, but like the girl she had been before any of this, before the debt and the desperation and the careful years of positioning. And Eleanor felt the grief of it like a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. "No," Eleanor said. "It isn't." She set down the tea measure. She turned and looked at her sister, at the exhaustion beneath the beauty, at the effort it had taken to perform that performance for so many years without the audience that had been promised. "Caroline," she said, "I'm sorry." Caroline's chin lifted. "Don't be," she said, and the composure came back like a door closing. "I'll find another way." She said it the way she said everything, with conviction that was mostly real and partially constructed, and Eleanor chose to honor the conviction rather than examine the construction. "I know you will," Eleanor said. Caroline left. Eleanor turned back to the tea. She thought about what she was walking toward: a large house in the north, a man with a managed leg injury, and a direct way of speaking, and dark eyes that paid attention to things. A practical arrangement that she had agreed to for practical reasons. Safety. Stability. Work that mattered. She thought about the moment on the bench when he had asked if there was anything she wanted to ask him, and the surprise on his face when she'd asked about his leg. "I'll learn what helps," she had said. She didn't know yet that those 4 words were the beginning of everything. She spooned the tea into the pot. She added the water. She waited for it to steep. Somewhere upstairs, she could hear her father's footsteps, lighter than usual, moving faster. The step of a man whose debt was about to be cleared and whose youngest daughter was going to make it possible. She heard Rebecca's door close. She heard Caroline's heels on the upper hallway, precise and controlled, moving away. The tea steeped. Eleanor poured it. Strong. No sugar. She drank it standing at the kitchen counter alone, with the afternoon light coming through the window in long, flat lines, and she thought, "This is the last cup I'll make in this house. The next one I make will be somewhere else entirely, for someone I've barely started to know, in a life that has not yet told me what it intends to be." She put the cup down. She was ready. The wedding took place the next morning, not the following week. Not after a suitable period of arrangement and announcement and the gathering of family from distant counties. The next morning at 8 o'clock in the small church at the edge of the Whitfield property, with the Reverend Aldous Crane officiating, and Jonathan Whitfield standing to the side, wearing the expression of a man who had survived something he hadn't expected to survive. Eleanor wore her mother's dress. It fit well enough. Nobody commented on it. Caroline did not come down for breakfast. Rebecca came down, ate her eggs in silence, and said when Eleanor passed her chair, "I hope you know what you're doing." It wasn't cruel. It was the closest thing to genuine concern that Rebecca knew how to offer, and Eleanor accepted it as such. "I don't," Eleanor said honestly. "But I think that's all right." Rebecca picked up her fork. "It won't be easy. An isolated estate, a man you barely know." "I know enough," Eleanor said. "You know he takes his tea unsweetened." "That's not nothing," Eleanor said, and went to find her shawl. Nathaniel was already at the church when they arrived, standing outside with his hat in his hands, and he looked at Eleanor when she came up the path with the same steady attention he'd given everything since he walked through the Whitfield front door. Not with the ardor of a man in love, not with the practiced admiration of a man performing courtship, but with the clear, considered look of someone making a decision they had already made, and were now confirming was correct. "Miss Eleanor," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They went inside. The ceremony was short. Nathaniel said his vows in a voice that was quiet and even without flourish, the way a man might sign an important document with full understanding of what he was committing to, and no performance of feeling he did not have. Eleanor said hers the same way. The Reverend Crane, who had known the Whitfield family for 20 years and had christened all 3 daughters, watched Eleanor with an expression that was half concern and half something. Eleanor couldn't quite name until later when she thought about it on the road north and realized it had been relief. He had always worried about the quiet one. He had never said so. Now he didn't have to. Jonathan shook Nathaniel's hand after. The handshake lasted longer than it needed to. Something passed between the two men, the weight of the debt, the terms of the settlement, the unspoken acknowledgement that a transaction had been completed. And then Jonathan turned to Eleanor and took both her hands and held them, and didn't say anything. And Eleanor realized she was looking at the truest thing her father had shown her in years. Not words. Just the grip of his hands and the look on his face. "Take care of yourself," he finally said. "I will," she said. She meant it. The road north was long, and they traveled it mostly in silence, which Eleanor had half expected and found she didn't mind. Nathaniel rode beside the carriage rather than inside it for the first portion of the journey, and she watched him through the window. The easy way. He sat the horse, the left leg adjusted slightly against the stirrup, and thought about what she was riding toward. She had never been more than 30 miles from the Whitfield estate. She had read about the Hudson River Valley in books, the wide gray-green river, the estates climbing the hillsides, the long flat stretches of agricultural land that had been farmed since before the Revolution. She had imagined it in the abstract way of someone who has only words to build pictures from. The reality was larger. At midday, Nathaniel pulled his horse alongside the carriage window. "We'll stop at the next town," he said. "There's an inn, food." "All right," she said. He started to pull back, then stopped. "Are you—" He seemed to consider the word he wanted. "Are you comfortable?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and she thought he'd prefer the truth, nervous. He looked at her for a moment. "So am I," he said, and pulled the horse back without elaborating, and Eleanor sat with that for the rest of the distance to the inn, turning it over, finding it unexpectedly steadying. He had not said it to comfort her. He had said it because she'd been honest, and he'd reciprocated. That was the deal they had made. That was what it was going to be. She found she could work with that. The inn was crowded for a Tuesday, and the innkeeper's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Petro, looked at Eleanor, and then at Nathaniel, and then back at Eleanor, with the particular expression of someone cataloging information for later distribution. Nathaniel ordered food without ceremony, and they sat across a table from each other for the first time without the architecture of the Whitfield dining room between them. It felt different, more honest. "Tell me about the house," Eleanor said. He looked up from his food. "Ashcroft Manor." "Unless there's another house I should know about." Something shifted in his expression. She was learning to read the small movements, the fractional adjustments that stood in for the broader expressions other people wore openly. That one was closer to amusement than anything she'd yet seen on him. "There's only the one," he said. "It's large, larger than you probably want. It was built by my grandfather in 1783, added to by my father twice, and I've spent the last 4 years mostly trying to stop it from falling apart in the sections he added." He paused. "The original structure is sound. The additions need work." "How many staff?" 8 full-time. A housekeeper named Mrs. Greer. She's been there since before I was born, and she runs the house with the force of a military operation and the flexibility of a stone wall." "Does she know about me?" "She knows I was going to see the Whitfield daughters and intended to return with a wife." He met her eyes. "She doesn't know which one." Will she be pleased it's me rather than Caroline? The amusement moved a fraction closer to actual. She will have opinions. She always does. I'd advise you not to take them personally. And the estate staff, the farm workers. 43 spread across the property. There've been some disputes, I'll tell you about those on the road. And there's a steward named Harker who manages the North Fields. He's competent, and he knows it, and he lets you know he knows it. He stopped. You'll want to meet him early. He'll try to assess you before you can assess him. How would you recommend I handle that? Nathaniel considered it seriously. Show him the accounts first, he said. Harker respects numbers more than introductions. If you know what the Northfields ought to be producing and can compare it to what they're actually producing, he'll decide you're worth talking to. And are the Northfields producing what they ought to be? A pause. No, he said. They're not. Then I'll start with those accounts, Eleanor said. He looked at her across the table for a moment, with the look she was beginning to recognize. Inventory assessment. The steady recalculation of someone who kept expecting to be wrong and kept not being. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone quieter, maybe. On the inside. I'm quiet on the outside because it's efficient, Eleanor said. On the inside, I'm generally asking a great many questions. Ask them, he said. I'd rather answer questions than wonder what you're not asking. So she did. She asked about the tenants, and the lease agreements, and the state of the southern orchards, and the river access rights that were apparently the subject of the legal dispute he'd mentioned. And he answered all of it with the same direct economy he'd applied to everything else, and the food went cold, because neither of them remembered to eat it. And Mrs. Petrow refilled their tea twice, with the look of a woman who was revising her initial assessment of the situation and couldn't quite decide what to replace it with. When they finally rose to leave, Nathaniel dropped a coin on the table, and then, as an afterthought, said, "The tea here is poor. I apologize." Eleanor looked at him. He was already putting on his coat. "I'll manage," she said. "I know," he said. He stopped. "I noticed." She picked up her shawl. "Thank you," she said, "for noticing." They went back to the road. Ashcroft Manor appeared around a long curve late in the afternoon, and Eleanor's first impression was not of its size or its architecture, but of its silence. It sat at the end of a long drive, broad and gray-stoned and serious, with the particular stillness of a place that had held its breath for a long time. She understood that silence. She had lived in it herself. Mrs. Greer was waiting at the door. She was a woman of approximately 60, built like someone who had never once permitted herself to be moved by anything she didn't choose to be moved by, and she looked at Eleanor, the way Eleanor had learned certain people looked at things that hadn't yet been properly assessed, fully carefully, without bothering to hide the looking. "Mrs. Ashcroft," she said. She said it the way you'd place a stone to test the ice with just enough weight to see whether it held. "Mrs. Greer," Eleanor said. "I understand you've run this house since before Mr. Ashcroft was born. I'd very much like to learn how it works before I change anything." A pause. Brief. Meaningful. "Would you?" Mrs. Greer said. "Yes. And I'd like to see the household accounts. All of them. This week, if possible." Another pause longer. "All of them includes the ones Mr. Harker manages separately," Mrs. Greer said, which was either information or a test Eleanor couldn't yet tell which. "Especially those," Eleanor said pleasantly. Something moved through Mrs. Greer's expression. Not warmth, nothing so immediate as that, but a recalibration. A minute adjustment of expectation. She stepped back from the door. "I'll arrange it," she said. "Your rooms are prepared. Dinner is at 7. Eleanor stepped inside. The house smelled of beeswax and old wood, and something fainter beneath, that the specific smell of a large space that had been maintained without quite being inhabited, like a body breathing, but not quite living. She'd smelled it before, in the Whitfield estate. After her mother died, when the rooms that had been her mother's were cleaned but not used, and the things in them arranged but not touched. She thought, this house is waiting for something. She thought, I can work with that. The first 3 weeks were an education. Eleanor was methodical about it, in the way she was methodical about everything, starting from the edges and working inward, like reading a room before entering it. She spent the first week walking the property with Mrs. Greer, asking questions and listening to the answers and asking follow-up questions that made it clear she had actually heard what was said. She spoke to the kitchen staff and the housemaids and the groundskeeper and two of the older tenant farmers who had been on the land since Nathaniel's father's time, and she listened to all of them with the same attention, which was not something they were accustomed to. She found the accounts on the fourth day. They were in 3 separate sets of ledgers, one that Mrs. Greer maintained for household expenses, one that Nathaniel kept for the estate income and land management, and a third that belonged to Harker and covered the North Fields and river operations. Eleanor sat with all 3 for most of an afternoon, cross-referencing columns with the focused silence of someone doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. Harker found her there. How was a man of about 50, compact and weathered, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been the most competent person in the room for long enough that he'd stopped checking. He stood in the doorway of the estate office for a moment before Eleanor looked up, and she registered the pause he'd wanted to see what she'd do before she knew he was there. "Mr. Harker," she said without looking up from the ledger, "the Northfield yield for the last quarter is recorded as 40 bushels below your projection from March. But the March projection is significantly below the previous year's actual yield, which suggests the projection was adjusted downward to make the shortfall appear smaller. I'd like to understand why." Silence. She looked up. Harker was watching her with an expression that had started as assessment and was now something more complicated. "Those are Mr. Ashcroft's accounts," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'm Mrs. Ashcroft." Another silence. "The yield dropped because of the dry spell in June," he said. "The dry spell affected the Southfields too," Eleanor said. "Their yield dropped by approximately 12%. The Northfield drop is significantly larger. The March projection adjustment I'm looking at here would appear to account for a drop nearly twice that size before the dry spell even occurred." She closed the ledger and folded her hands on top of it. "I'm not suggesting anyone did anything dishonest, Mr. Harker. I'm suggesting the numbers have something to tell me that the current recording method obscures, and I'd like your help understanding what it is." She watched him decide. She could see it happen, the weighing, the recalibration, the thing she'd learned to recognize in people who operated by competence rather than affection, where respect had to be earned in a specific currency, and she'd just laid down the right denomination. "The March adjustment," he said slowly, "was made because I was expecting a problem with the northern drainage. It didn't materialize. I didn't update the projection." He paused. "I should have." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Would you be willing to walk me through the Northfields this week? I'd like to see the drainage situation myself." "You want to look at drainage ditches?" He said it without contempt, just genuine confusion. "I want to understand the land," Eleanor said. "I can read accounts all I want, but accounts don't tell me what they're based on. The land does." She paused. "I'd value your expertise." That last sentence did the thing she'd hoped it would do, because it was true, and he could hear that it was true. And competent people in Eleanor's experience responded to genuine recognition better than to most other things. "I can take you Thursday," Harker said. "Thursday works," Eleanor said. He left. Eleanor opened the ledger again. In the margin, very small, she wrote, "Projection adjustment, not fraud oversight. Harker competent proud will respond to directness. Northfield drainage investigate." She had started keeping notes in the margins of her own small book since the second day. By the end of the first 3 weeks, it was half full. She and Nathaniel existed in the same house the way 2 rivers sometimes ran parallel, close, visible to each other, but not yet mingled. They shared meals. They shared evenings in the parlor where he worked through correspondence and she worked through the household accounts or read or wrote her notes. They talked about the estate, the tenants, the legal dispute over the river access rights, which was more complicated than he'd summarized at the inn, and which Eleanor had opinions about that she offered carefully, and he listened to more carefully than she'd expected. But they slept in separate rooms at opposite ends of the upper hall, and he did not suggest changing this, and neither did she, and neither of them spoke about it, which was its own kind of conversation. She learned his rhythms. He was up before dawn. She'd hear his boots on the stairs in the dark, and he worked until early afternoon, and then he dealt with correspondence, and then he worked again until dinner. He took a half hour after dinner where he did nothing, just sat. She noticed he looked out the window during this time in a way that wasn't seeing the view so much as putting down the day, and then he went back to the correspondence. On the 8th evening, she set a cup of tea on the table beside him during the half hour. He looked at her. He said nothing. He drank it. On the 9th evening, she did the same. On the 10th evening, he said without looking up from the window, "How do you know when to bring it?" "I watch when you finish dinner," she said. "There's a moment when you set your napkin down a certain way. After that, about 6 minutes." He was quiet. 6 minutes, he said. "Give or take. You've been counting." "I've been paying attention," she said. "It's different." He turned from the window and looked at her. Then with something she hadn't seen on him before. Not the inventory. Look, not the steady assessment, but something less armored than those. Something that might have been the first movement of whatever came after you stopped expecting to be surprised and got surprised anyway. "Sit down, Eleanor," he said. She sat. "Tell me what you've found in the accounts," he said. "All of it. Don't manage the report. Just tell me." So she told him. She told him about the Northfield projection adjustment and her conversation with Harker and what she planned to do on Thursday. She told him about the kitchen supplier who was charging 20% above market rate for candles because the previous housekeeper had never checked the price, and Mrs. Greer hadn't known to check it. She told him about the 2 tenants in the east section whose lease agreements contained a clause she was fairly certain had been miscopied, not maliciously, just carelessly, that was costing them more than they owed, and would eventually produce either resentment or abandonment of the land. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The candle supplier you said, Whitmore." "Yes. I'll cancel the contract this week. I'd suggest doing it by letter citing a price review. You don't want him to know you have a new—" She paused. "A new set of eyes on the accounts." "Not yet. It's useful to let people assume the arrangement continues while you're changing it." He stared at her. "That's exactly how I handled the river rights negotiation last spring." "I know," Eleanor said. "I read your notes. I leave those notes locked. Mrs. Greer has a key. She let me in to take inventory of the office supplies. I may have been thorough about the inventory." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, with the expression of someone watching something unexpected arrange itself into a shape that made sense, "You are not what I expected." "You said that at the inn." "I'm saying it again," he said. "I expect I'll say it several more times." Eleanor set her hands in her lap. She thought about the next part carefully before she said it. "Mr. Ashcroft, I want to be useful to you. Actually useful, not performed usefulness. If there are things you're managing that I could help manage, I'd like to know about them. All of them. Not the version that's been simplified for the drawing room." I was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd miscalculated. Then he got up and went to the desk and opened the top drawer and took out a different set of papers and brought them back and set them on the table between them. "The river rights dispute," he said. "Here's what hasn't been in the Gazette." They talked until midnight. Mrs. Greer found Eleanor in the kitchen at 6 the next morning, as she had every morning for the past week, which meant Mrs. Greer had stopped being surprised by it, but had not stopped finding it worth noting. "You were up late," Mrs. Greer said. It was not a question. "Yes." Eleanor was reviewing the kitchen inventory. She had discovered 2 days ago that the cook, a capable but uncommunicative woman named Dora, was purchasing flour from a different supplier than the one listed in the accounts, which was either an unauthorized substitution or an informal arrangement that predated any of the current paperwork. Eleanor had not yet decided which. "Mr. Ashcroft was up late too," Mrs. Greer said. "Yes. He doesn't usually work past 10. He had things to review." Mrs. Greer was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant she was deciding whether to say something. "He doesn't usually talk to people past 10 either," she said finally. Eleanor looked up from the inventory. "Mrs. Greer, can I ask you something directly?" "You generally do," Mrs. Greer said, which was the closest thing to a compliment Eleanor had received from her. "What did you expect me to be?" The question landed cleanly. Mrs. Greer regarded her with the full, careful attention she applied to most things, and said, "Younger, softer, less likely to be in my kitchen at 6 in the morning with my accounts." "These are the household accounts," Eleanor said. "They're mine as well as yours." "Yes," Mrs. Greer said. "That's becoming clear." "I'm not trying to displace what you've built here," Eleanor said. "I can see what you've maintained, and it's considerable. I'm trying to understand it." She paused. "I'd like us to work together if you're willing." Mrs. Greer was quiet. Then she moved to the table and sat down, which she had not done before in Eleanor's presence, which meant something Eleanor filed away. "The flour supplier," Mrs. Greer said. "Dora switched 2 years ago because the listed supplier was delivering underweight sacks. I knew about it. I should have updated the accounts." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I'll make a note, and I'll update the accounts." "You won't mention it to Mr. Ashcroft?" "Not if it doesn't need mentioning," Eleanor said. "Things that are already solved don't need to become things that are punished." Mrs. Greer looked at her with the closest thing to unguarded expression Eleanor had seen on her. "No," she said quietly, "they don't." After that, things between them shifted in the small, substantial way that things shifted when two competent people decided they were on the same side. It wasn't friendship yet. It was something more practical than that, and in some ways, more durable mutual recognition between two people who both understood what it meant to hold a household together through sheer force of quiet, constant effort. 3 weeks became a month. The month brought two things Eleanor had not anticipated. The first was a letter from Caroline. It arrived on a Thursday morning, and Eleanor opened it at the breakfast table because she had no reason not to, and Nathaniel was present, also eating, also not looking at her. And then she read the first paragraph and felt something cold move through her. The letter was gracious on the surface. Caroline was a woman who could make almost anything gracious on the surface. It spoke of how well the Whitfield household was managing, how Jonathan was in good health, how Rebecca had begun corresponding with a gentleman in Albany who appreciated her intellectual interests. Then, in the third paragraph, with the elegant precision of a well-placed blade, "Father has been speaking to the Whitfield creditors regarding the arrangement. There is some question as to whether the full settlement as agreed will satisfy the initial debt, given that certain notes were not disclosed to Mr. Ashcroft before the agreement was made. Father asks if you might speak to your husband regarding an additional sum. It would only be temporary, of course. We would not ask if the situation were not urgent." Eleanor set the letter down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it beside her plate. Nathaniel looked up. "Trouble. A letter from my family," she said. He waited. She looked at him across the table, this man she had been married to for a month. This man she was beginning to understand in the particular way that came from watching someone function rather than perform. And she made a decision. "My father has withheld debt information from the settlement agreement," she said. "My sister is asking me to request additional funds from you to cover it." Nathaniel set down his fork. "How much?" he said. "She doesn't say the amount. That's strategic. She wants me to open the conversation, not close it." "Are you going to?" "No," Eleanor said. "I'm going to write back and tell her that any financial communication regarding the Whitfield estate should be directed to your attorney, not to me, and that I will not be serving as an intermediary for undisclosed debts." She paused. "Unless you'd prefer to handle it differently." He was looking at her with the inventory look again, but deeper now, recalibrating something more significant than before. "No," he said. "That's exactly right. I'm sorry," she said. "About my father." "Don't be," he said. "You didn't hide it from me. That matters more than what he did." She wrote the letter that afternoon. She wrote it plainly and closed it without cruelty and sent it before she could decide to soften it, because some things required being said clearly, or they would have to be said again. The second thing she hadn't anticipated arrived 4 days after the letter. It arrived in the form of Thomas Harker, knocking on the estate office door at 7 in the evening, with a look on his face that Eleanor had learned to recognize in the past 4 weeks as Harker's expression for a problem he hadn't solved, which was rare enough to be immediately alarming. "There's someone on the North Road," he said. Claims to be a land agent from Albany. Says he has papers regarding the river rights. Nathaniel was at the desk. He looked up sharply. What kind of papers? Says they're legal filings. Says the matter's been re-adjudicated. Harker paused. He's asking for you specifically. But he came to me first, which means he wanted to know if I was home before I knew he was here, Nathaniel said. He was already standing. Wait, Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. What does the filing claim? I haven't seen it, Harker said. Get it before you bring him in, Eleanor said. Tell him you need to log his credentials before he can meet with Mr. Ashcroft. It's bureaucratic, it gives him nothing to object to, and it gets you the document. She looked at Nathaniel. If it's a legitimate re-adjudication, he'll hand the papers over without hesitation. If he hesitates, we know something's wrong with them before he's in the room. Harker looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. Do what she says, he said. Harker left. Nathaniel stood by the desk and didn't pace, but Eleanor could see the effort not to. This is the Halverson claim, he said. It's been through 2 courts already and failed both times. Then the papers are fraudulent or they're a tactic, Eleanor said. Either way, you want to see them before he does his introduction. His introduction is performance. The papers are the actual thing. Harker returned in 6 minutes with a document in hand and the look of a man who had found what he expected to find, which in this case was nothing good. Nathaniel read it in silence. His face didn't change, but his jaw did the particular tightening she'd learned to track. He handed it to Eleanor. She read it carefully twice. Then she said, This is dated incorrectly. The court reference is real, but the adjudication date predates the actual hearing by 11 days. Someone's transposed the filing date to create the appearance of priority. She looked up. A good attorney will have this thrown out in an hour. Nathaniel stared at her. How do you know that? I read the original river rights correspondence, she said. The ones in the locked desk. The silence that followed had a different quality than the others. It was the silence of a man discovering that the person he had carefully and practically married had turned out to be something he hadn't known to plan for. Eleanor, he said. Yes. Are you always like this? She considered the question. I'm always paying attention, she said. This is what it looks like when it's useful. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he did something she had not yet seen him do. Not the fractional shift of almost amusement, not the recalibrating inventory look, but something open and unguarded and real, something that had not yet learned to protect itself. He laughed. It was brief. It startled him she could see that like a sound he'd made by accident and didn't immediately regret. He covered it quickly, but it had been there, and Eleanor felt it land somewhere in her chest with the weight of something significant. Get the attorney, he said. Tonight. I'll write the letter, Eleanor said. She was already at the desk. Outside, the agent on the North Road was still waiting, standing in the summer dark with his fraudulent papers and his carefully prepared introduction, with no idea that the thing he'd come to threaten had already been identified, assessed, and begun to be dismantled by a woman who had spent 20 years being ignored and had spent every one of those years paying very close attention. Eleanor sharpened the quill. She began to write. Nathaniel stood behind her and read over her shoulder without asking, and she let him, and neither of them said anything about the fact that this was the first time they had shared a space smaller than a room. The first time they had been close enough that she could feel the particular warmth of someone standing near, and neither of them moved away. The letter was done in 10 minutes. It was clear and specific and would accomplish exactly what it needed to accomplish, and Nathaniel read it when she finished and said, Perfect. I'll have Harker ride tonight, she said. Yes, he said. He didn't move from her shoulder. She didn't move away. Outside, the summer night was settling over Ashcroft Manor, with the particular fullness of a season at its height, warm and heavy and full of the smell of growing things and turned earth and the distant sound of the river that ran through the northern edge of the property, the river that people were trying to take from them and would not take because Eleanor Whitfield Ashcroft had read the original documents and knew what the dates said and what they meant and what to do about it. She capped the ink. She handed the letter to Harker when he knocked. She listened to his horse leave the drive at a canter. And then the house was quiet again, the quiet that was beginning to feel less like absence and more like the particular silence of a place that had finally, after a long time, found the thing it had been waiting for. The attorney's name was Edmund Fisk, and he arrived 2 days after Eleanor's letter, which was faster than Nathaniel had expected, and exactly as fast as Eleanor had calculated, based on the urgency she'd embedded in the third paragraph of the request. Fisk was a small man with sharp eyes and a coat that had been expensive once and was now merely well-maintained, which Eleanor took as a favorable sign. A man who respected a good coat. Even past its prime was a man who understood the difference between the thing and the appearance of the thing. He sat across from Nathaniel in the estate office, with the fraudulent papers on the table between them, and said after approximately 45 seconds of reading, "This is embarrassingly bad forgery." "Embarrassing for whom?" Nathaniel said. "For whoever put their name to it," Fisk said. "The court reference is genuine. I know this filing. I was present at the original hearing, but the date has been altered. Here." He put his finger on the number. "The ink in the final digit is fractionally darker than the rest of the line. They changed a 7 to a 4. Amateur work." He looked up. "Who identified this before I arrived?" Nathaniel glanced at Eleanor, who was sitting at the side of the desk with her account book open, writing nothing, listening to everything. "My wife," he said. Fisk looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man rearranging furniture in his head to make room for new information. "You have a background in legal documentation, Mrs. Ashcroft." "I have a background in reading things carefully," Eleanor said. The original River Rights correspondence mentioned the hearing date specifically. The number didn't match. "The original correspondence," Fisk said. "You have copies." "I have Mr. Ashcroft's files," she said. "I've read them thoroughly." Fisk turned back to Nathaniel with a look that communicated several things simultaneously, chief among them. "Where did you find her, and are there more?" He said only, "The Halverson claim is finished. This forgery attempt, documented properly, may actually allow you to countersue for harassment and legal interference. That would close the River Rights question permanently, rather than waiting for another filing in 2 years." "Do it," Nathaniel said. "It will take some time. Several months, possibly through winter." "Do it anyway." Fisk gathered his papers and accepted the tea. Eleanor poured him without ceremony and drank it with the appreciation of a man who hadn't had a good cup in some time, and then he said as he was leaving, "Mr. Ashcroft, the last time I handled your father's affairs, the estate accounts were complicated. I'm glad to see they appear to be in better order." "They are," Nathaniel said. Fisk put on his hat. He looked once more at Eleanor. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "if you ever need a legal reference regarding the river documentation, my office has the original court transcripts." "I'd like copies," Eleanor said. "I'll send them," he said, and left. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then Nathaniel said without preamble, "My father's accounts were complicated," is Fisk's way of saying they were a disaster. Eleanor waited. "He borrowed against the estate twice without telling anyone except the creditors," Nathaniel said. "I found out after he died. I've spent 4 years paying it back while also trying to run the land and handle the legal challenges from people who thought the debt made us vulnerable." He paused. "It's almost clear. Another year, maybe 18 months. "I know," Eleanor said. He stopped. "You know, I worked it out from the account books," she said. "The repayment structure is visible if you look at the capital outflows over the past 4 years. You've been methodical about it." She paused. "It's impressive, actually. Most men in that situation would have sold land." "I thought about it," he said. "I know that too," she said. "There's a notation in the 1814 ledger. You wrote, 'Sell North Parcel,' and then crossed it out." She looked at him. "You crossed it out hard, like you were angry at yourself for writing it." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight in it, the kind that came from being seen more clearly than you'd expected. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." "Is there anything in this house you haven't read?" "Not yet," she said. "I'm working on the correspondence from 1809. He stared at her for a moment. Then he pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and looked at the ceiling, and she understood he was deciding whether to be alarmed or something else entirely, and she waited, and he lowered his hand and said, "Good." Just that. Good. She went back to her account book. He went back to his desk. Outside, the summer was in the kind of thick, heavy heat that pressed against the windows and made the light look liquid, and somewhere on the north fields, Harker was directing the second round of drainage improvements that he and Eleanor had designed together on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks ago, standing in the mud at the edge of the field, while Harker explained the water table, and Eleanor asked questions that made him stop and look at her sideways, the way people looked at her when they realized she had actually heard what they said. It was all working. That was the thing she hadn't quite let herself believe yet. It was all actually working. Which was, she was beginning to understand precisely when things tended to go wrong. Rebecca's letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after Fisk left. Eleanor had learned to identify Rebecca's handwriting from the outside of the envelope. By now, the particular aggressive clarity of someone who wrote as if daring the letters to be misread. She opened it at the breakfast table the same way she'd opened Caroline's in front of Nathaniel, because she'd decided early on that transparency was the only policy she could sustain without exhausting herself. The letter was 3 pages. Rebecca had never used one word where 12 would do. The first page established with considerable rhetorical architecture that Rebecca was not writing to ask for anything. She was simply concerned. She was writing as a sister, not as a representative of the Whitfield household's financial situation, which she mentioned only briefly and parenthetically, which meant she was writing about it primarily. The second page covered Eleanor's decision to marry Nathaniel Ashcroft, which Rebecca characterized as, and here. Eleanor paused and read the phrase twice, and then read it aloud to Nathaniel because she couldn't quite decide how to summarize it. A capitulation to pragmatic despair, dressed in the clothing of sensible choice. Nathaniel looked up from his plate. "I beg your pardon." "My sister Rebecca," Eleanor said. "She has opinions about our marriage." "What else does she say?" Eleanor scanned the third page. "She says that I have wasted what she calls a remarkable capacity for intelligence on domestic management, that a woman of her words, peculiar and underappreciated clarity of mind, ought to be doing something that the world can see, and that living quietly on an estate in the north is a form of self-erasure." She set the letter down. And then she asks in the final paragraph whether we might host her for a visit of 2 or 3 weeks, as the Albany gentleman has proven disappointing, and she finds the Whitfield estate depressing without someone to argue with. Nathaniel was quiet. "What do you think," he said, "about what she said, the self-erasure?" Eleanor considered it honestly, because he'd asked honestly, and he could tell the difference. "I think Rebecca's definition of being seen requires an audience," she said. "I've never needed the audience. I need the work to matter." She looked at the letter. The Halverson forgery, identifying that handling it the way we did that mattered. Harker's drainage project is going to increase the Northfield yield by 1/3. That matters. Rebecca would argue, nobody will ever know I did it. She paused. "I don't need them to know. I need it to be done." Nathaniel was looking at her with the expression that had become more frequent in the past 2 weeks. The open one, the less armored one. "Does it bother you," he said, "that they don't know? Does it bother you that you crossed out sell north parcel instead of selling it?" she said. A pause. "No," he said. "Then you understand." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "Write back and tell her she can visit. 2 weeks, not 3. Eleanor looked up. "Are you certain Rebecca is—" "I know what Rebecca is," he said. "I met her." "You met her for 6 hours." It was enough. He picked up his fork. "Tell her 2 weeks. If she's going to argue, she can argue here. It's less destructive than letters." Eleanor wrote back that afternoon. She told Rebecca 2 weeks and to come prepared for early mornings and outdoor work, because the estate did not accommodate sleeping past 7, which was a kindness in Eleanor's estimation. Rebecca needed to understand what she was arriving at, not what she imagined she was arriving at. What she didn't write, and what she sat with for a long time after she sealed the letter, was the other thing. Rebecca's letter had done the thing underneath the criticism and the rhetorical performance. Rebecca had called her intelligent. Remarkably so. Peculiarly and underappreciatedly clear-minded. Rebecca, who competed with everyone and conceded to no one, had written that in a letter without being asked. Eleanor stared at the sealed envelope for a long time. Then she put it in the outgoing post and went back to the Northfield drainage reports because the work mattered, and she was not going to become a person who needed to be told that it did. The trouble started on a Wednesday. It started the way most trouble started at Ashcroft Manor, which was quietly at the edges, in a way that looked like something minor, until you pulled the thread and found it connected to something that wasn't minor at all. One of the East tenants, a man named Colby, who had been farming 12 acres on the river-adjacent land for 11 years, came to the estate office and asked to speak with Mr. Ashcroft. Nathaniel was in the South Fields. Eleanor received him. Colby was a man of 40-something with sun-hardened hands and the particular wariness of someone who had learned to be careful with authority, and he sat across from Eleanor with his hat in his hands and looked at her with the expression that meant he was deciding whether she was the real thing or a placeholder. "Mr. Ashcroft isn't in," Eleanor said. "I can help you, or you can wait until this afternoon." He stopped, turned his hat. "It's a lease matter, ma'am." "Then I'm the right person," Eleanor said. "I've reviewed all the lease agreements in the East section." She opened her account book to the relevant page. "You're in the third parcel. Is this about the clause discrepancy I flagged last month?" He looked at the book. He looked at her. "You flagged it. The lease agreement contains a yield share clause that appears to have been miscopied from an earlier template," she said. "The percentage listed is higher than the standard established in 1811. I've been preparing to correct it and issue amended agreements to all affected tenants. You're one of 4. The wariness on Colby's face did something complicated. It didn't disappear that would have taken more than one conversation, but it shifted into something that had more room in it. "I've been paying that rate for 3 years, he said. "I know," Eleanor said, "and the overpayment will be credited against next quarter's lease." She paused. "It was an error in recording Mr. Colby, not a policy. The rate should always have been the standard one." How was quiet enough that Eleanor could track the thing moving across his face, the long, careful recalibration of a man who had lived for 3 years under a clause that cost him more than it should have, and had come in today, braced for a fight, and was now sitting with the unexpected weight of not needing to fight. "Just like that," he said. "Yes," she said. "Would you like me to write the correction now, or would you prefer to wait until all 4 amended agreements are ready?" "Now," he said. "If that's yes, now." She wrote it. She had him sign his copy, and she signed hers, and she gave him the document, and he held it with both hands like a man who wasn't entirely sure it would still be real when he got home. At the door he turned. "Mrs. Ashcroft." "Mr. Colby." There are folks who weren't going to come in about this," he said. "Figured it wasn't worth the trouble." "Who?" "Parrish and the Drummond brothers." Eleanor wrote the names in the margin of her book. "I'll go to them," she said. He blinked. They shouldn't have to decide whether it's worth the trouble to correct an error we made," she said. "I'll go to them." He nodded slowly. He put on his hat. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the ma'am had a different quality than it would have had an hour ago, and they both knew it. Nathaniel heard about it from Harker. He arrived back at the house in the late afternoon, and Harker was in the yard, and said with the directness that was Harker's form of high regard, "Your wife went out to the Drummond parcel today." Nathaniel stopped. "She went herself. Rode out with young Thomas from the stable. Spent about an hour with each of them. Drummond Sr. signed the amended lease. His son signed too." Harker paused. "Parrish is going to take another day to think about it." "Why?" "Because Parrish doesn't trust decisions that come easy," Harker said. "Mrs. Ashcroft told him to take all the time he needed, said she'd come back Thursday." Nathaniel stood with that for a moment. "She's going back Thursday." "Said she would," Harker said. And then, with the casualness of a man saying something that was not casual, "Drummond told me he hasn't had a landlord come to him in 11 years. Just sent the documents by courier." He looked at Nathaniel steadily. "Your tenants are going to talk about today for a long time." Nathaniel went inside. Eleanor was at the desk in the estate office, writing the amended lease for Parrish with the clean, even handwriting that he'd come to recognize the way he recognized footsteps as a particular presence, specific and unmistakable. "Harker told you," she said without looking up. "He did. The Drummond brothers were reluctant at first," she said. "I think they expected me to try to negotiate the credit lower. When I didn't, the older one asked me twice if I was certain the numbers were right." She paused. "I showed him my calculations. And he asked if he could keep the paper. A beat. I said yes." Nathaniel sat down in the chair across from her desk, the one that was becoming his chair, the one he sat in when they talked in the evenings, the one that had shifted from a casual arrangement to something with the weight of habit. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes. You're changing things." She looked up from the paper. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "That's not what I—" He stopped. "I've managed this estate for 4 years trying to hold things steady. Stop the losses. Prevent the collapse. I've been thinking of it as defense, holding the line." He was looking at her with the open expression, the less armored one, and it was more open now than it had been 2 weeks ago. Less careful about the fact of being open. "You're not holding lines. You're building something." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at him carefully, the way she looked at everything fully, with the attention that most people never quite aimed at him directly. "So are you," she said. "You have been for 4 years. You just couldn't see it from inside it." He was quiet. "Is that what it looks like from outside?" "It looks like a man who refused to sell the north parcel when it would have been easier," she said. "Who kept 43 people employed through 2 hard seasons. Who's been paying back a debt he didn't create because he didn't want the land encumbered." She paused. "It looks like someone who cares about this place very much and has been too tired and too alone to know that it shows." The silence that followed was long enough to have texture. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked at her. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and she understood he did not mean the estate. "I know," she said. "I'm not—" He stopped again. "The things I know how to do are not— they're not the things that—" He pressed his hand against the desk, a grounding gesture, someone reaching for something solid. "I can run a farm. I can read a military map. I can hold a line for 4 years. I don't know how to—" He looked at her. "I don't know how to say what I mean when what I mean is something I don't have a word for yet." Eleanor was very still. She had learned that stillness was what some people needed, the room that came from no movement, no hurrying, no filling in the space before they found what they were looking for. "Then don't say it yet," she said. "There's time." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very—" He stopped. "Patient isn't the right word." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." "What is the right word?" She thought about it honestly. "Present," she said. "I'm just present, that's all." He nodded slowly, as if that word had landed somewhere and stayed. He picked up the papers on his side of the desk and looked at them without quite reading them, and she picked up her pen and went back to the parish amendment, and the evening settled around them like something that knew where it belonged. Rebecca arrived on a Friday. She arrived with 2 large trunks and an opinion about the road conditions and a look on her face that was taking rapid and comprehensive inventory of Ashcroft Manor from the moment the carriage door opened. Eleanor met her at the drive because it was correct to do so, and Rebecca stepped down and took both her hands and looked at her with the sharp eyes that missed very little. "You look well," Rebecca said. It came out slightly surprised. "I am well," Eleanor said. "You look—" Rebecca was still looking at her, recalibrating. "Different." "I've been working outdoors more." "That's not what I mean." Rebecca released her hands and looked at the house. "It's larger than I expected." "Come inside. Mrs. Greer has your room ready." "Mrs. Greer," Rebecca said, testing the name. "The housekeeper. You wrote about her. She's formidable. Don't try to outmaneuver her in the first 24 hours. Wait until you understand the terrain." Rebecca turned and looked at her with genuine surprise. "Eleanor, was that a tactical suggestion?" "It was practical advice," Eleanor said, and led her inside. Nathaniel met Rebecca in the front hall, with the same steady, measured attention he applied to everything, and Rebecca met him with the sharpness she applied to everything, and the first 30 seconds of their introduction had the quality of two people taking each other's measure and finding the measurement more interesting than expected. "Mr. Ashcroft," Rebecca said, "my sister tells me you take your tea unsweetened." "Your sister notices things," Nathaniel said. "She always has," Rebecca said. Nobody else noticed that she did. She said it plainly, without accusation, just as a fact she'd decided to state out loud. "I'm glad someone finally did." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "So am I, Miss Whitfield," he said. "So am I." Eleanor, standing between them, felt something move through her that she didn't have an immediate name for and didn't try to name. Just let it be present. Let it be real. Filed it alongside the other things she was accumulating in this life that kept turning out to be more than she'd bargained for. Rebecca was difficult and invaluable and exhausting in approximately equal measure. She argued with Harker about crop rotation theory on her second day, and was right about enough of it that Harker spent his third day grudgingly testing her suggestions on the smallest test plot, which was as close to concession as Harker got. She argued with Nathaniel about the river rights legal strategy, and identified a procedural angle that Fisk subsequently confirmed was valid. She argued with Eleanor about household management, which was the one argument Eleanor was not particularly interested in having, and said so. "You're running this house like a military operation," Rebecca said. They were in the kitchen on the fourth morning, Rebecca at the table with a cup of tea, Eleanor reviewing the week's provision orders. "The comparison has been made," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Greer made it first." "I don't mean it as criticism. I mean you have a system, an actual system, with the accounts and the supplier contracts and the tenant documentation." Rebecca set down her cup. "Where did you learn this?" "I taught myself," Eleanor said. "At home. The Whitfield accounts." "Father's accounts were a disaster." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's why I learned to read them." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "You've been managing things for years and nobody saw it," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Eleanor said. "I didn't see it," Rebecca said. And the way she said it was different from her usual delivery, without the rhetorical scaffolding, without the performance of intelligence. Just a statement, and underneath it, something that was working out what it owed. "You were busy seeing other things," Eleanor said. "So was everyone." "That's too kind," Rebecca said. "It's accurate," Eleanor said. "Kindness and accuracy aren't mutually exclusive." Rebecca looked at her for a long moment, with the expression that Eleanor had only seen on her sister in rare, unguarded moments, the one underneath the sharpness, the one that was just a person without armor. "Are you happy?" Rebecca said. "Actually. Not managing the question. Actually." Eleanor stopped reviewing the provision orders. She put down her pen. She thought about the question with the full attention it deserved, because Rebecca had asked it with full attention, and that was the minimum it was owed. "I think—" She stopped. Started again. "I think I'm somewhere I can be useful in ways that matter. I think I'm with a man who pays attention when I speak, and means what he says, and has never once asked me to be smaller than I am." She paused. "I think I'm building something. I'm not sure I've ever built something before. I've maintained things. I've kept things from falling apart. This is different." She looked at her sister. "So yes. I think yes." Rebecca picked up her tea. She nodded once, the nod of someone who has gotten what they came for, even if they hadn't entirely known they were coming for it. "Good," she said. "That's—" A pause. "Good." She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The second letter from Jonathan arrived on Rebecca's 9th day. It was not addressed to Eleanor this time. It was addressed to Nathaniel. Eleanor knew about it because Mrs. Greer brought the post, and Nathaniel was in the estate office, and Eleanor was at the side desk, and he opened it in front of her without thinking, which meant the distance between them had shrunk in ways that neither of them had formally acknowledged. He read it. His face changed in the way Eleanor had learned to track, not overtly, never overtly, but in the specific stillness that meant something was costing him something. He handed it to her without speaking. Jonathan had not been subtle. The letter was not gracious on the surface the way Caroline's had been. It was a direct request, more than a request, something closer to a demand, wrapped in the language of family obligation, for a substantial sum citing a debt that had not been disclosed in the original settlement agreement, attaching what purported to be documentation of this debt, and concluding with the suggestion that a man of Nathaniel's means would surely find the amount trivial. Eleanor read it twice. Then she said, "The documentation is real." Nathaniel looked at her. "What?" "The debt is real," she said. "I've seen reference to it in correspondence from 1815. Your acquaintance who recommended the Whitfield daughters." She paused. "Was his name Alderman Gross?" A silence. "Yes," Nathaniel said carefully. "Why?" "Because there's a letter in your 1815 correspondence from Alderman Gross recommending the Whitfield family that mentions in passing that Jonathan Whitfield has a friendship with a man named Carver who holds a promissory note against the estate." She set down Jonathan's letter. "I think Gross may have withheld that information when he recommended the arrangement. I think your father's old business associate helped set this up. The whole introduction. Knowing that once you were married, you'd feel obligated to cover the remaining debt." The room went very still. Nathaniel was not looking at her. He was looking at the letter in his hands, and the quality of his stillness had changed. It was not the controlled stillness of a composed man. It was the absolute stillness of a man who was working very hard not to show the full extent of what he felt. "They planned this," he said, quiet, precise. "I think so," Eleanor said. "Your father. And possibly Gross. I don't know how much my father understood about the debt disclosure. He may have simply not corrected the omission. That's different from planning it." She paused. "I'm not defending him. I'm trying to be accurate." Nathaniel set the letter on the desk. He stood. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, which he hadn't done before, and she understood it wasn't exclusion. It was a man needing a moment to put something down before he could pick up something else. She waited. "Eleanor," he said, still at the window. "Yes." "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Did you know before? When you agreed to, did you know this might happen?" The question was fair. She'd known it was coming, and she'd known she owed it the fullest honest answer she had. "I knew my father had debts beyond the disclosed amount," she said. "I didn't know the full scope. I didn't know about Carver or the Gross connection. I knew that my father was. I knew he was desperate, and desperate people make choices they don't always tell their children about." She looked at his back. "I should have told you what I suspected before we married. I didn't because I didn't have proof, and I was afraid." She stopped, made herself finish it. "I was afraid that if I raised questions, the arrangement would fall apart before it began." He turned around. He looked at her across the room. "You were afraid," he said. "Yes." "Of what?" She held his gaze. "Of going back," she said. "Of returning to that house and being of returning." The silence between them had the weight of a confession, which it was, and the weight of a trust, which it also was. The particular trust that came from showing someone the fear underneath the composure. He crossed the room. He sat down at his desk, not the chair across from her, but his own desk, the position he occupied when he was deciding something. He picked up a pen. He put it down. "I'm not paying the debt," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "Your father." "I'll write to him," she said. "Today, clearly." "And Gross." "Fisk can handle Gross." She paused. "Nathaniel." He looked at her. She had not used his given name before. They had been Mr. and Mrs. Ashcroft across all the formalities of the past weeks, and the name in her voice now had a different weight from anything she'd said to him before, and they both felt it land. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have told you what I suspected." He was quiet for a moment. "You were protecting something," he said. "I understand protecting something." He looked at her steadily. "Don't do it again." "No," she said. "I won't." He nodded. He picked up the pen again. He wrote something at the top of a blank sheet, fast, decisive, the handwriting of a man who had made his decision and was done deliberating. "I'm writing to Fisk," he said. "This ends today." "Yes," she said. She went back to her desk. She picked up her pen. She began to write her own letter to her father, whom she loved and was angry at and grieved for. In the complicated, layered way, you grieved people who were still alive, but had made choices that couldn't be unmade. She wrote the truth. She wrote it plainly and without cruelty, and without leaving any room for a different interpretation. She wrote that the arrangement Jonathan had hoped to exploit was not and would not be exploitable. She wrote that she expected her father to manage his remaining obligations honestly or not at all. She wrote that she would always be his daughter. She sealed it before she could change her mind. Rebecca appeared in the doorway at that moment with the particular expression of someone who had been near enough to hear things and was deciding how to exist in the aftermath of them. "Should I leave?" Rebecca said. "My visit. I can go earlier." "Sit down," Eleanor said. Rebecca sat. "Is there anything you know," Eleanor said, "about Father and an Alderman Gross and a man named Carver?" Rebecca's face did something complicated. The composure held, but something shifted underneath it. "Carver came to the house twice," she said carefully. "Last autumn. Father sent us out of the room." "But you heard something." "I'm Rebecca," she said. "I hear everything." "Then tell me," Eleanor said. Rebecca told her. It took 15 minutes. By the end of it, Eleanor had 3 more pages of notes and a clearer picture than she'd had before. And the picture was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared, which was she was finding about the best you could expect from truth. Nathaniel came to the doorway while Rebecca was still talking and stood there and listened without interrupting. And when Rebecca finished, he said, "That's enough to give Fisk what he needs." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Rebecca," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you." Rebecca blinked the genuine, unperformed blink of someone caught without their armor ready. "I didn't do anything," she said. "You told us the truth when it would have been easier not to," he said. "That's not nothing." Rebecca looked at him for a moment, with the expression she got when someone had said something that reorganized things inside her. Then she looked at Eleanor. Then she looked at her tea. "Your husband," she said to Eleanor, "is occasionally insufferable in his reasonableness." "I know," Eleanor said. "I find it useful." The tension in the room broke along those words not loudly but cleanly, and they were all 3 of them, somewhere slightly different from where they'd been an hour ago, and the difference mattered in ways that would take time to fully understand. Outside, the summer was beginning its slow lean toward autumn. The days were still long and heavy, but there was something at the edges of them now. A quality of light in the late afternoon that was different from July's flat brightness, something with more angle to it. The North Fields were producing better than they had in 3 years. The tenant agreements were corrected and signed. The fraudulent river rights claim was being unwound by Fisk's capable hands in an Albany courthouse. And in the estate office at Ashcroft Manor, 2 letters sat sealed on 2 desks waiting to go out on the Morning Post. Written by 2 people who had walked into an arrangement with their eyes open and discovered in the steady, ordinary dailiness of shared work and shared truth that open eyes could see things that no one had promised would be there. The trouble wasn't over. Eleanor knew that with the certainty of someone who had learned to read the accounts. There were more columns than the ones she'd checked, and some of them hadn't settled yet. But that wasn't the same as not being ready. She was ready. She picked up the sealed letter. She set it in the post pile. She smoothed her hands on her skirt and turned back to the provision orders, and the afternoon moved on around her, the way afternoons did, steadily without asking, carrying everything forward, regardless of whether you were prepared. She was prepared. Rebecca left on a Monday. She left, the way she arrived, with 2 large trunks and opinions about the road. But the opinions were different now, and both women knew it. She stood at the carriage door and held Eleanor's hands the same way she had at the house, but the grip was different, more honest, less performance in it. "Write to me," Rebecca said. "Actually write, not just estate updates." "I'll write," Eleanor said. "And if Father—" Rebecca stopped. "If he does anything else, tell me first, before you handle it alone." Eleanor looked at her sister, at the sharpness that was still there, would always be there, but was operating now in a slightly different direction, aimed at something beyond its usual target. "I will," she said. Rebecca nodded. She looked at Nathaniel, who had come out to see her off because it was correct, and also because he had over the past 2 weeks developed a wary and genuine respect for her that he expressed primarily by arguing with her seriously, which Rebecca received as the highest form of regard. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Take care of her," Rebecca said. Not as a request. As an assessment delivered to someone she'd decided was capable of fulfilling it. "She doesn't need taking care of," Nathaniel said. "No," Rebecca agreed. "But she's been doing it alone for long enough. Someone should stand alongside her for a change." She looked at him steadily. "I trust that's you." The silence was brief and complete. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "It is." Rebecca got into the carriage. Eleanor watched it until it turned onto the road and she couldn't see it anymore. And then she stood there one moment longer with the particular feeling that came from saying goodbye to something you hadn't known you needed until it was time to let it go. Nathaniel came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They went back inside together. 3 days later, the sky changed. Eleanor noticed it first in the way the light shifted at midday, the particular flat yellowish quality that had nothing to do with clouds and everything to do with what was coming behind them. She was in the kitchen, reviewing the autumn provision orders with Mrs. Greer, when she looked out the window and said, "How bad do the storms get here in September?" Mrs. Greer looked at the light. Her face did something that Mrs. Greer's face rarely did, which was to express concern without any management of it. "Bad," she said. "How long before this one?" "Hours. Maybe less." Eleanor closed the provision ledger. "Get the indoor staff together. I want to go through the storm preparations." She was already moving toward the door. "Where's Harker?" "Northfields, last I knew." "And Mr. Ashcroft?" "Rode out to the Colby parcel this morning. Drainage question." Eleanor pulled on her coat. "Send young Thomas on the fastest horse to get them both back. Now, Mrs. Greer. Not when you've finished what you're doing. Now." Mrs. Greer moved with a speed that Eleanor had not yet seen from her, and hoped never to require again, which meant the older woman knew exactly what that sky meant, and was grateful someone else had seen it first. Eleanor went to find Harker's storm preparation notes from the previous year, which she had read in August, as part of her systematic work through every document in the estate office. She found them in the third drawer, read them in 4 minutes, identified 3 things on the list that were no longer accurate given the drainage improvements made to the north fields, and was writing amended instructions when the first of the indoor staff appeared in the doorway. By the time Nathaniel came through the front door 40 minutes later, she had the house staff organized into 3 groups with specific assignments, had sent 2 of the farm workers to secure the equipment barn, had identified the estate documents, most critical to protect, and had moved all of them, plus the household accounts, to the interior room on the ground floor that shared no exterior walls. Nathaniel came in and stopped. He looked at the organized activity. The staff moving with the focused quiet of people who knew what they were doing because they had been told clearly. And then he looked at Eleanor, who was standing in the center of it, with Harker's amended notes in one hand and a list of outstanding tasks in the other. "The north drainage," she said before he could speak. "Your improvements change the water flow on the east side of the barn. If the flooding comes from the riverside, the old preparation plan routes it directly toward the foundation. I've redirected the sandbag placement." He stared at her. "How do you know where the sandbags are?" "I inventoried the equipment barn in my second week," she said. "There's a complete list in the third drawer of the estate office. Or there was. It's in the interior room now with the documents." She looked at him. "The Colby fence line on the south pasture, is it secured?" "No," he said. "I was going to—" "Harker," she said. Harker appeared from the direction of the kitchen. "Ma'am." "South pasture fence. Take Patterson and the 2 Drummond boys if they're still on the property." "They're here," Harker said, and was moving before the sentence finished. Nathaniel watched him go. Then he looked at Eleanor. "What do you need from me?" She handed him a portion of the list. "The upper barn latch is broken. It's been broken since August, and I have a note in the repair ledger, but it didn't get done. If that barn door goes in this wind, we lose everything inside it." He took the list. He looked at it for 1 second. He went. Eleanor turned back to what was left, and kept moving. The storm arrived faster than the sky had suggested it would, because that was what storms did when you were still preparing for them, and it arrived with a force that made it clear immediately that this was not ordinary autumn weather. The sound of it came first. A pressure change that Eleanor felt in her ears before she heard the wind, and then the wind itself, and then the rain, which came not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had opened a door. Inside the house, Eleanor moved room to room in a pattern she had established in her head before the first drop fell. She checked each exterior room for water intrusion, sent staff to place the prepared cloths at the vulnerable threshold points she'd identified in August when she'd noticed the discoloration on certain floorboards that told you where the water came in when it came. She checked the cellar hatch 3 times because the cellar was where the preserved food stores were, and losing them this close to winter was a problem she refused to have. Patsy, the young housemaid, was frightened. Eleanor found her in the back hallway, pressing herself against the wall with both hands flat on the plaster, eyes closed, while the sound of the storm made the house feel smaller. Eleanor put her hand over one of Patsy's. "Patsy," she said, "I need you." Patsy opened her eyes. "Ma'am, the linens in the Upper East room. If water gets in through that window, we need to move them before they're ruined. I need someone who knows where everything goes. That's you." The girl straightened. It was not instant courage, she was still frightened. Eleanor could see that, but it was the particular straightening that came from being given a task that mattered by someone who clearly believed you could do it. "Yes, ma'am," she said, and went. Eleanor followed because the Upper East window was the one she was most worried about. She was right to worry. The window held, but the frame had enough age in it that the rain was driving through the seal at the top right corner in a thin but steady stream, and Eleanor and Patsy worked together for 20 minutes with cloths and a bucket and a solution involving a wedge of wood that Eleanor improvised from a broken chair rail, and when it was done, the linens were dry and the window was as weatherproofed as it was going to get, and Patsy looked at Eleanor with the expression of someone who had just discovered they were braver than they'd known. "That's good work," Eleanor said. "You fixed it," Patsy said. "We fixed it," Eleanor said. "There's a difference. Go check the south rooms." Patsy went without hesitation. Eleanor stood in the east room for a moment and listened to the storm work against the house, the pressure of the wind, the percussion of the rain, the occasional deep sound from somewhere outside that was something large moving that shouldn't be moving. She made a note in her head, east window frame replace before next winter. Budget accordingly. Then she went back downstairs. Nathaniel came in from the barn 40 minutes into the storm with the look of a man who had been in a serious fight with something much larger than himself and had not entirely lost. He was soaked through, and there was blood on his right hand from where something had caught him. A nail maybe, or a splinter from the latch, and Mrs. Greer intercepted him in the hallway with a cloth, and the expression of a woman who had seen worse and intended to manage this efficiently. "The barn," Eleanor said. "Secured," he said. "The latch is temporary, but it'll hold." He looked at his hand with the detached assessment of a man who had learned to evaluate injuries quickly and without sentiment. "It's not deep." "Let Mrs. Greer look at it," Eleanor said. "It's fine, Eleanor. Nathaniel." She said his name with the particular quality she'd developed over the past 3 months, the one that was not a request and not a command, but simply the statement of someone who was correct and knew it and expected him to know it too. Let her look at it. He let Mrs. Greer look at it. While she did, Eleanor told him what had been handled: the sandbags, the east window, the cellar, the document room, the staff assignments. He listened with his hand held out and Mrs. Greer working on it, and his eyes on Eleanor's face, tracking everything she said with the focused attention that was she had come to understand his version of the look she gave things she cared about. Complete presence. Total inventory. "The south fence," she said when she finished. "Harker's still out there," he said. "Last I saw it was holding. And the Drummond brothers. I sent them to their own property." He paused. "Their barn is older than ours. I figured they needed to be home." Eleanor stopped. She looked at him. He was having his hand wrapped by Mrs. Greer, and he was watching Eleanor with the steady dark eyes and the specific expression she had not yet fully named, the one that was beyond the inventory look, beyond the open but careful look, something that had stopped protecting itself. "You sent them home," she said. "They have their own people to take care of," he said. "The fence could wait." She nodded. She turned toward the hallway. He said, "Eleanor." She turned back. "Are you all right?" The question was simple, and he asked it simply without the layering of other questions inside it. Just the direct inquiry of one person checking on another, and the directness of it caught her somewhere behind her ribs. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." "Good," he said. And then, with the expression that was not quite amusement, but had the same warmth in it, "You organized this entire house in under an hour." "Someone had to," she said. "Yes," he said. "But it was you." Mrs. Greer tied off the bandage with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been watching this conversation while pretending not to, and had reached a conclusion about it she intended to keep to herself. "Done," she said, and removed herself from the hallway with the discretion of someone who understood when two people needed to be left in a space. Eleanor and Nathaniel stood in the hallway with the storm working against the house around them, and she thought about what he'd just said. It was you, and the way he'd said it, not like a compliment, and not like a surprise, but like a fact being officially entered into record. "There's still the North Barn equipment," she said, because work was what she knew how to do with feelings that hadn't found their shape yet. "I know," he said. "I'll go back out." "Take Patterson. He's afraid of—" "I know. Take him anyway. He'll be less afraid with company." She paused. "And take the rope from the equipment room. The east pasture gate, if it goes in this wind, it'll take the post with it." He looked at her for a beat. "You've already thought about the post," he said. "I've already thought about everything," she said. "That's what I do." He put on his hat. He went back out into the storm. She went to check the cellar hatch again. It was during the third hour that everything nearly went wrong. The sound came from the north, a crack that was different from the wind, different from the rain. A specific deep fracturing sound that Eleanor heard from inside the house and understood before she could have explained how she understood it. She was in the estate office checking the document room when she heard it, and she was moving toward the north door before the echo had finished. She got there at the same time as two of the farm workers, and they all three stood in the doorway looking at the north barn, which had lost a significant portion of its eastern wall. Not collapsed, not quite, but failed enough that the remaining structure was now unstable, in a way that was going to become catastrophic if the wind changed direction, which from the feel of the air it was about to do. And inside the barn, because this was the barn with the equipment, the plows and the tools and the seed stores for next spring's planting. There were 3 workers still securing things when the wall had gone. Eleanor went across the yard before she had consciously decided to go. She heard someone behind her shout something she couldn't tell what the wind took it, and she kept moving. The rain was a force against her now, not just weather, but something physical. A weight she pushed through, and she thought as she moved, the structural failure is in the east wall. The remaining support is the north post and the center beam. Those will hold for a few minutes, if the wind doesn't shift. I need 3 people out of there in a few minutes. She got to the barn door. She went in. The 3 workers were at the far end, 2 of them trying to move a piece of equipment. One of them frozen in the middle of the floor, looking at the gap in the wall with the particular stillness of someone who had stopped being able to make decisions. "Look at me," Eleanor said. Loud, firm. Not shouting, but carrying over the noise with the specific quality of a voice that expected to be listened to. The frozen man looked at her. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then walk. To the door. Go." He went. The other 2 had the equipment half moved. Eleanor looked at it to assess the weight, the distance, the time, and said, "Leave it. We can replace equipment. You're not replaceable. Go." "But the seed." "I will personally account for every lost seed in that inventory," Eleanor said. "I know exactly what's in here because I inventoried this barn in August. We can account for it. We cannot account for you. Go." They went. Eleanor was 3 steps behind them when the wind shifted. She heard Nathaniel before she saw him, his voice cutting through the noise from the direction of the door. "Eleanor, now!" She ran. She cleared the door, and he caught her arm. Not to stop her, to keep her moving his hand, closing on her arm with a grip that was not gentle and was not meant to be, and they were both moving away from the barn when the remaining structure shifted, groaned, and the center beam came down with a sound like a cannon shot. They stopped. They turned. The barn had not fully collapsed. It was the specific kind of structural failure that looks total and was actually contained. The remaining 3 walls, still standing, the roof on one end intact. The east side was done. The rest would survive. Nathaniel's grip on her arm did not release. She became aware of this at the same moment. She became aware that her heart was doing something she generally did not permit it to do in situations that required functioning, which was trying to exit her chest through her sternum. "The workers are out," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She was not entirely certain how. "I know," he said. His voice was not completely steady. She turned to look at him. His face was the least composed she had ever seen. It not frightened exactly, because she was coming to understand that Nathaniel Ashcroft's relationship with fear was the relationship of someone who had made a separate arrangement with it. A man who had been in battles and learned where to put the fear so it didn't interfere with the doing. But this was different. This was not battle fear. This was something more specific and more personal and more recent. His hand was still on her arm. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said again, and still didn't let go. She looked at the ruined east wall. She looked at the 3 workers standing 20 yards away in the rain hole and breathing. She looked at Nathaniel's hand on her arm. "The workers first," she said. "Someone needs to check. Harker has them," he said. Harker was there, moving toward the 3 men with the competent authority of someone who had already identified the task. "Eleanor." His voice had dropped under the wind, now low and direct, aimed at her and not at anything else. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking there were 3 people inside, and the beam had approximately 4 minutes, she said. "You don't know that." "I did the calculation. I had enough time. You—" He stopped. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was doing something she hadn't seen before. The full version of the thing she'd watched move toward this moment for 3 months. The thing that had been arriving piece by piece in the tea at midnight, in the laugh. He hadn't expected it was. "You said in the hallway an hour ago." It was all there now, at once, unmanaged, not composed, not protected. "You calculated the beam," he said. "Yes." "And then you went in." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment in the rain, with the wind around them, and the wreckage of the barn wall behind her, and the 3 men alive and standing 20 yards away, and he said, "You are the most—" He stopped. He didn't have the end of that sentence, and she could see him looking for it and not finding it, which was the most honest thing she'd seen on him yet. "I know," she said, which was presumptuous, and she knew it was presumptuous, and she said it anyway because it was true, and they had agreed on truth. He made a sound that was not a laugh, and not a laugh. Something at the edge between those things, and he finally released her arm. "Come inside," he said. "In a minute. I need to talk to Harker about the barn inventory." "Eleanor." "1 minute," she said. "I'll be there." He looked at her. Then he stepped back and let her go, because that was also what he did. He had learned that about her, and she had learned that he'd learned it. And there was a whole conversation in that single step backward, in the release, in the trust, contained in the act of not following. She went to Harker. She went through the inventory. She confirmed all 3 workers were unhurt. She noted the structural damage with the part of her mind that was always noting things, always cross-referencing, always filing for later. Then she went inside. The storm broke toward evening. It didn't end gracefully. It diminished by stages. The wind dropping first, then the rain thinning from force to persistence, to ordinary autumn rain, the kind that was cold and unremarkable and didn't threaten anything. The house was intact. The main barn was intact. The north barn had lost its east wall and would need significant repair before winter, which was not ideal and was not catastrophic, and Eleanor had already begun a preliminary cost estimate in the margin of her account book. The estate staff ate together in the kitchen that evening. all of them indoor staff and farm workers alike at Mrs. Greer's direction, which was unusual and which Mrs. Greer made happen with the efficiency of someone who understood that what people needed after surviving something was the evidence of each other's continued existence. There was hot food, and there was cider, and there was the specific warmth of a room full of people who had worked alongside each other in difficult conditions and come through it and knew they had. Nathaniel moved through the room and spoke to each person. Eleanor watched him do it. She was at the edge in her way observant, and she saw something she hadn't seen from him in the months she'd been watching him. He was not managing the room. He was not performing leadership. He was just there in the room with the people asking each worker by name how they were listening to the answers. The frozen worker from the barn had his name, Martin said by Nathaniel, with a hand briefly on the man's shoulder, and Martin sat up slightly differently after that. Mrs. Greer came and stood beside Eleanor. She looked at Nathaniel moving through the room. "I've worked in this house for 31 years, she said. She said it the way Mrs. Greer said most things plainly without decoration. "I watched his father manage staff and his grandfather before that." She paused. "He's better than either of them." Eleanor said nothing. "I was alone too long," Mrs. Greer said. "Men like that, they don't deteriorate the way some do. They just tighten, pull in, manage themselves and everything around them, and eventually they forget what it's like to be in a room with people and not be responsible for controlling the outcome of everything in it." She looked at Eleanor. "He's not doing that tonight." "No," Eleanor said. "He's not." "That's new," Mrs. Greer said. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel across the room, at the specific ease she could see beginning to exist in his shoulders, the way he was listening to Harker with the expression of a man who was not also simultaneously managing 17 other calculations, just listening. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." Mrs. Greer nodded once with the precision of a woman filing a conclusion. Then she went to see about the cider. Later, after the staff had gone to their quarters and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a place that had been tested and held, Eleanor found Nathaniel in the estate office. He was not working. He was sitting in the chair across from her desk, his chair, the one that had become his over 3 months of evenings, and he was not doing anything. Just sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man letting something down. Eleanor came in. She poured 2 cups from the pot that had been keeping warm on the small burner. She set his in front of him and sat at her desk and held hers and didn't speak. He picked up the cup. He drank. He set it down. "When I came in and saw what you'd done," he said, "with the staff, the assignments, the sandbags, I thought this is what this place has been missing." Eleanor waited. "And then I thought—" He stopped, started again, and she could hear him choosing precisely the way he did when the thing he was saying mattered enough to require precision. "I chose you because you were practical, because you were the only person in that room who wasn't performing. I thought I was making a sensible decision." "You were," Eleanor said. "I was," he agreed. "But that's not—" He looked at her. The expression was fully open now the way it had been in the rain, but without the rain between them, without the emergency to put somewhere else. Just the office and the 2 cups and 3 months of evenings that had been building towards something without being named as such. "I didn't know what I was actually choosing," he said. "I thought I was choosing competence. I didn't know I was choosing—" He stopped. "You still don't have the end of that sentence," Eleanor said quietly. "No," he said. "I don't." "That's all right," she said. "There's time. You said that before. It's still true." He looked at her with the expression that had stopped protecting itself. "I could have lost you today," he said. "In the barn. You didn't. I know I didn't, but I could have." He turned the cup in his hands. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." "Tell me." "When I came around the corner of the barn and saw you come out—" He paused. "The feeling I had wasn't the feeling I would have had about losing a competent estate manager." The room was very still. "No," Eleanor said carefully. "I wouldn't think it was. I don't know what to do with that," he said. He said it plainly without pretense of composure the way he'd said, "I don't have the word for it yet," back at the beginning of autumn, when they had been figuring out how to be in the same room with each other. But it was different now. The not knowing was different. Not the not knowing of someone who hadn't looked at the thing yet, but the not knowing of someone who was looking directly at it and finding that it was larger than expected. Eleanor set down her cup. She thought about everything that had brought her here, the kitchen table with her hands flat on it. The morning he arrived, the tea she'd poured without asking, the bench in the morning light, the drive north with the questions at the inn, the document room, and the fraudulent papers, and the letters from her father, and the Northfield drainage, and the tenant leases, and every evening in this office, with the tea, and the accounts, and the growing accumulation of ordinary days that had not felt ordinary at all. She thought about what he'd looked like when he laughed, what he'd looked like in the rain with his hand on her arm, and his voice not quite steady. What he looked like right now, sitting in his chair across from her desk, holding a cup of tea she'd made without being asked, not knowing what to do with something he hadn't planned to feel. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to know what to do with it," she said. "I've been paying attention. I know what it is, and I know what—" She stopped, made herself finish it because they had agreed on truth, and this was truth, even if it was frightening to say out loud. "I know what I feel." The silence between them was the specific silence that preceded something irrevocable. Not because irrevocable was dangerous, but because it was real, and real things required a moment to be understood before they were entered. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice had a different weight than it had ever had before. Not Mrs. Ashcroft. Not even the Eleanor he'd said when she'd first used his name. Something more personal than both of those. Something he'd found on his own between then and now, in the specific privacy of watching her and beginning without permission or plan to know her. "Yes," she said. He stood. He crossed the room, not quickly, not dramatically, with the same deliberate unhurriedness she had noticed the day he rode up the Whitfield Drive in the rain, and he stood at the edge of her desk, close enough that she could see the careful thing happening in his expression. The thing he'd been managing since the barn and was now choosing not to manage. He reached out and took her hand from the desk. He held it the way he'd held her arm in the rain, but differently. Not the grip of someone keeping something from being lost, but the hold of someone choosing what to keep. "I don't have the sentence yet," he said. "I'm still working on it." "Take your time," Eleanor said. "I think—" He looked at their hands. "I think I'm going to need a while." "That's fine," she said. "I'll be here." He looked up from their hands to her face, and she saw the thing she'd been watching approach from the distance of 3 months. Finally arrive without armor, without management, without the protection of practical language or careful qualification. It was the thing she'd seen the shape of in August, when he'd laughed by accident in September, when he'd said it was you in October, when he'd stood at her shoulder reading the letter she was writing, and neither of them had moved away. It was there now, fully, without question. She tightened her hand around his. Outside, the autumn rain continued steady and ordinary and cold, no longer a storm. Just weather, just the season doing what seasons did. The north barn stood with 3 walls, and the evidence of what had come through it, and the tenant leases were corrected and signed, and the fraudulent papers were in Fisk's capable hands in Albany, and the household accounts were balanced to the last penny in the interior document room, and 43 people had eaten together in the kitchen tonight, and were sleeping in their quarters intact and whole. Ashcroft Manor was not the same place it had been in July, when a woman with her hands flat on a kitchen table had told herself she would not cry. It was better. It was warmer. It was inhabited now in the way it hadn't been before, not just occupied and maintained, but genuinely fully lived in by 2 people who had walked in with open eyes and found in the daily accumulation of trust and work and truth something that no practical arrangement had promised and no fairy tale had quite described. The tea was cold. Neither of them noticed. Neither of them let go. The north barn wall went up in November. Harker managed the construction with the focused efficiency of a man who had been given both the resources and the authority to do something properly, which in Harker's experience was rarer than it should have been. Eleanor had drafted the repair budget. 3 days after the storm, cross-referenced it against the autumn harvest income, which was thanks to the Northfield drainage improvements, the strongest yield Ashcroft Manor had produced in 6 years, and presented it to Nathaniel on a Tuesday morning with the figures already checked twice. He had looked at the budget for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, "Do it." "The full repair, not the temporary." "The full repair," he said. "Do it right." She did it right. The wall went up solid and true, with better timber than the original, and a foundation adjustment that Harker had wanted to make for years and had never had the authorization to attempt. When it was finished, Harker stood back and looked at it with the expression he reserved for things he considered genuinely well done, which was an expression Eleanor had learned to value precisely because it was so rarely deployed. "Good work," Eleanor said. "Your budget held," he said, "to the dollar." "I know," she said. "I checked." Harker looked at her sideways, the look she'd gotten from him since the Tuesday afternoon they'd stood together in the mud of the North Field, except now it had less assessment in it and more of something that didn't have a simple name. Regard, maybe. The specific regard of someone who had been competent and alone in that competence for a long time, and had found unexpectedly someone else operating at the same frequency. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "Mr. Harker. The Drummond brothers asked me to tell you something." She waited. "They said the amended lease, the corrected one, they framed it." Eleanor blinked. "They framed the lease agreement." "Hung it in the kitchen," Harker said. "Elder Drummond told his son, that's what a fair contract looks like. Don't forget it." He paused. "I thought you should know." Eleanor stood with that for a moment. She thought about Elder Drummond holding the paper with both hands. She thought about Colby coming through the estate office door braced for a fight he didn't need to have. She thought about Martin, the frozen worker from the barn, sitting up differently after Nathaniel said his name. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She went back inside. She did not make a note of it in her account book. Some things didn't need to be recorded to be kept. Joel. Fisk's letter arrived on a gray Wednesday in late November, and Eleanor was the one who opened it because Nathaniel was on the North Road with Harker, and the letter was sitting on the desk, and she had learned had been explicitly told in the direct way Nathaniel communicated things that mattered, that Ashcroft Manor's business was her business without qualification or exception. She read it twice. Then she sat down, which she didn't usually do mid-morning. The Halverson claim was finished. Not postponed, not pending, finished permanently in a way that could not be refiled or reframed or resurrected under a different name. The forged documents had served Fisk's countersuite precisely as Eleanor had calculated they would, and the result was a legal judgment that closed the river rights question with the kind of finality that cost the Halverson interest, not only the claim, but a significant financial penalty for what the court had formally characterized as deliberate interference with established property rights. The river was theirs. Completely. Finally. But that was not the part of the letter that made Eleanor sit down. The second section of the letter covered the separate matter of Alderman Gross and the undisclosed debt from Jonathan Whitfield's arrangement. Fisk had been thorough. Eleanor had expected nothing less, and what he'd found was more complete than even Rebecca's account had suggested. Gross had known about the Carver note before he recommended the Whitfield daughters to Nathaniel. He had withheld it deliberately, with the expectation that once the marriage was formalized, Nathaniel's sense of obligation would provide leverage for recovering the note's value through the new arrangement. What Fisk had not expected to find, what nobody had expected, was the third element. Jonathan Whitfield had not known. Eleanor read that section 3 times. Fisk was careful with his language, as attorneys were, but the conclusion was unambiguous. The evidence indicated that Jonathan had disclosed the debts he knew about, and that Carver, acting through Gross, had deliberately kept the promissory note's existence from Jonathan, as well intending to surface it after the marriage as a claim against both families simultaneously. Jonathan had been as much a target of the scheme as Nathaniel. The desperate man trying to save his estate had been used as a mechanism by people with a longer game than he'd understood he was playing. Eleanor set down the letter. She thought about her father's face when he'd come to her room the night before the morning conversation. Would you be? Is this something you could accept? The guilt on his face. The complicated exhale when she said yes. She had thought she was reading a man who felt guilty about using her. She had been reading. She understood now, a man who felt guilty about a situation he didn't fully understand and couldn't control, and had managed the only way he knew how, which was imperfectly, and with love, and with the specific blindness of someone being manipulated by people more calculating than himself. It didn't absolve everything. The undisclosed debts he had known about those were still real. The letter he'd written to Nathaniel that had still been wrong. But it was different from what she'd believed, and different mattered, and she was a person who cared about accuracy even when accuracy was complicated. She picked up her pen. She began to write a letter to her father. Not the formal letter she'd written in September, the clear and boundaried and necessary letter. Something different. Something that started. Dear Father, I have received information today that changes my understanding of some things. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. Nathaniel came in from the road to find her at the desk with 2 letters in front of her, Fisk's and her own, and the expression she got when she was working through something with the full force of her attention. He read Fisk's letter. Read it, standing at the desk, and she watched his face move through the information, the way she'd watched it move through things before, steadily without performance, with the interior precision of someone who didn't waste reactions. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at her letter to her father, which was sealed, but which he recognized by the handwriting on the front. You're writing to him, he said. Yes. Before you told me about this. I wanted to. She stopped. I wanted to have the letter ready. I didn't want to wait until after we'd talked and then sit with it overnight. I needed to write it while I understood what I understood. He looked at her. That's fair, he said. The river writes judgment, she said. Fisk says it's permanent. I read it. How does it feel? I was quiet for a moment. It was the question he would not have known how to answer in July, and she had learned not to ask it then. She asked it now because she knew he could answer it now, and he knew she was asking because she wanted to know, not because she was managing him. Like something I can put down, he said. I've been carrying it for 4 years. He paused. It's lighter in here. He touched his chest briefly, a gesture she'd never seen from him, self-referential, unguarded. I didn't know it would feel like that. You've been holding the line, she said. For 4 years. You can stop holding it now. He looked at her across the desk. I know, he said. You've been saying that since September. You needed to hear it a few times. I needed to believe it, he said. Those aren't the same thing. She held his gaze. Do you believe it now? Yes, he said. And then with the expression that had become one of the fixed points of her understanding of him. The open one, the unarmored one, because of you. She looked down at the sealed letter. She looked at Fisk's letter. She looked at the account book, open to the current page. The North Barn repair figures, balanced to the dollar. The harvest income numbers, that were the best in 6 years. The Northfield projections for next spring that Harker had submitted last week with the cautious optimism of a man who had stopped expecting disappointment. Nathaniel, she said. Yes. I want to talk to you about something. He sat down. Not at his desk in his chair, the one across from hers. The one that was his in the way that things become yours through repeated choice rather than assignment. The spare room at the end of the East Hall, she said. I've been using it as a secondary document storage space since September. He waited. I'd like to make it into something else, she said. What? She looked at him steadily. A room for reading. For children eventually, if... She stopped. Made herself continue because they had built this on truth, and she was not going to flinch from the true thing now. If that becomes part of what this is. The silence was brief and total. Eleanor, he said. I'm not asking for a declaration, she said quickly. I know we haven't... She stopped again. I'm asking because I plan things far in advance, and I want to know if I'm planning for one life or another. I need accurate information to make accurate plans. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he did what he had done in the rain outside the barn. He crossed the distance. He came to her desk, and he took her hand from the desk and held it, and he said, Plan for the one where I don't intend to let you go. She looked at him. That's not a declaration. No, he agreed. But it's accurate. She felt her mouth do something she didn't fully control. which was to become a smile, not the managed, appropriate expression she'd had available for years in the Whitfield house, but the unmanaged kind, the kind that arrived without being summoned, the kind she was still at 20 years old, learning to trust. "All right," she said. "Then I'll plan accordingly." "Good," he said. He released her hand. He went to his desk. He picked up his pen. She went back to the account book. Outside November was doing what November did in the Hudson River Valley, which was to make the world very clear and cold and stripped of everything unnecessary. The trees were bare. The fields were put to bed. The river ran high and cold along the northern edge of the property, their property permanently finally, and the north barn stood on its new foundation with its new wall, solid as anything that had been built right. The letter from Caroline arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor had not heard from her eldest sister since the September letter, the one she'd answered by redirecting all financial communications to Fisk, the one that had closed a door and left it closed. She opened this one with the same care she applied to Caroline's correspondence, which was to read it looking for both what was said and what the saying was covering. What it said this time was different. Caroline had married. His name was a Mr. Jeffrey Hartwell of Hartford, Connecticut, and Caroline's description was careful, and Eleanor read the care like a musical score, hearing all the notes, including the ones left out. A man of good family and moderate means, who was, in Caroline's words, genuinely kind, which I find I value more than I expected to. Eleanor read that sentence 4 times. She thought about Caroline in the kitchen doorway in July, holding herself perfectly still, saying, "You just poured the tea." She thought about Caroline's voice when it had cracked just slightly, just enough, and sounded for a moment like the girl she had been. "I'll find another way," Caroline had said. She had found it. The letter continued. Hartwell had a house in Hartford and a modest practice, and Caroline was here. Eleanor found the word she was looking for in the texture of her sister's prose settled. Not triumphant, not positioned, settled. As if something that had been braced for a long time had finally been allowed to rest. At the bottom, in Caroline's precise handwriting. "I heard from Rebecca that you went into the barn during the storm. I'm not surprised. I want you to know that I'm not surprised. I don't think I ever gave you enough credit for what you were. I intend to do better." Eleanor set the letter down. She pressed her fingers against the table briefly, a grounding gesture she hadn't known she'd adopted until she caught herself doing it, had recognized it as something she'd learned from watching Nathaniel and had kept. She picked up her pen. She wrote back to Caroline. She told her about Hartwell, asked questions about Hartford, said she was glad about the kindness. She said, "I think we were all doing the best we could with what we had. That's enough. It has to be." She sealed it. She put it with the letter to her father, already sealed, already waiting for the morning post. 2 letters. 2 doors reopened at a different angle than they'd been before. December came with frost, and with the specific clarity that followed a year's worth of hard work arriving at its results. The harvest numbers were final. The North Field had exceeded even Harker's revised projections by 11%, which was the number that made Harker stand in the estate office and look at the column 3 times before he said anything, and what he said was, "The drainage." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And the lease corrections," he said. "Colby's parcel, when a tenant isn't paying 30% more than he owes, he puts that 30% back into his land, which improves our yield." He looked at her. "You understood that in August." "The accounts told me," she said. "I just listened." He nodded. He picked up the harvest report. He said, "I'm going to recommend to Mr. Ashcroft that we extend the drainage improvement to the southeast parcel in spring." "I'll prepare the cost analysis," Eleanor said. "I know you will," he said, and left, and the door closing behind him sounded like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had been a long time coming. Fisk came in person in mid-December, which he had not done since the summer, and he brought with him the final documentation on both the river rights judgment and the gross matter, which had resolved in a way that Fisk described as thoroughly, and I think permanently. Gross had been censured by the State Bar Association, and the Carver note had been voided by a separate court order, finding that it had been obtained through misrepresentation. Jonathan Whitfield, cleared of the deliberate manipulation charge, had written to Nathaniel directly. Nathaniel showed Eleanor the letter. He showed it to her in the estate office on a Tuesday evening, with the tea between them and the fire doing what fires did in December in the Hudson Valley, which was to make everything immediate and warm and close. Jonathan's letter was not long. It was not eloquent. It was a man who had made bad choices and been used by people with worse intentions, and who was in the late December of his life attempting to say something true about all of it, without the language for it. He wrote, "I did not give Eleanor what she was owed. I knew it then, and I know it now. I can only tell you that she is the best of what the Whitfield family ever produced, and that you are the first person besides myself who ever seemed to understand that, and that I am grateful, whatever else I am." Eleanor read it. She didn't read it twice. Once was enough. She handed it back to Nathaniel. He was watching her face with the attention that was, she had come to understand the way he expressed most of what he felt, through the quality of his watching, through the fullness of his presence, through the specific way he was always there when she looked up. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and he deserved the true version, "I'm sad for him. I'm not angry anymore. I think—" She paused. "I think being angry at someone who is also being deceived is a waste of something I'd rather use for other things." "What other things?" She looked at him across the desk. At the man who had ridden through rain alone and drunk his tea without sugar, and asked her an honest question, and listened to the answer. At the man who had laughed by accident in the estate office, and said it was you in the hallway during a storm, and held her arm in the rain with a grip that was not letting go. At the man who sat in that chair every evening and was simply steadily, entirely there. This, she said. "I'd rather use it for this." He held her gaze. He reached across the desk and picked up his cup and held it up slightly. Not a toast, nothing so performed as that, just an acknowledgement. A marker. She picked up hers. They drank. It was Fisk who brought the news that changed the final shape of things, and he brought it at the end of his December visit, standing at the front door, with his coat already on, and his hat in his hands, with the expression of a man who had saved something for last, because he wasn't certain how it would land. "There's one more thing," he said. Nathaniel and Eleanor were both in the hallway. They had been seeing him out together the way they did most things now, not formally, not because it was required, but because it was simply what had become natural in the months since the storm. "The Ashcroft estate debt," Fisk said. "Your father's borrowing. I've been managing the repayment schedule since 2013. "I know," Nathaniel said carefully. "The final note," Fisk said, "was held by the Carver interest." A silence. "The same Carver," Eleanor said. "The same," Fisk said. "When the Carver note to Whitfield was voided by the court order, I filed an immediate motion arguing that the underlying instrument used to secure the Carver-Ashcroft debt was tainted by the same misrepresentation. The court agreed." He paused. "The debt is discharged. Nathaniel, the estate is clear, entirely." The hallway was very quiet. Nathaniel stood still in the way. He stood still when something was costing him. But this was different from the costing him something stillness Eleanor understood immediately. This was the stillness of a man putting down something so heavy that the absence of it required a moment to understand. 4 years. He had spent 4 years holding a line. 4 years of North Parcel notation crossed out hard. 4 years of 43 people employed through 2 hard seasons. 4 years of managing an estate that had been encumbered before he took it, and that he had slowly, methodically, stubbornly refused to surrender. Eleanor put her hand on his arm. He looked down at her hand. He looked at her face. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying more completely, and they had both learned that some things were better held than spoken. Fisk put on his hat. "Happy Christmas," he said quietly, and let himself out. The door closed. The hallway held them. After a long moment, Nathaniel covered her hand with his. He said, "Eleanor." "Yes. I would like to move the guest furniture out of the east room at the end of the hall." She looked up at him. "The one I was going to make into a reading room." "Yes," he said. "I think we should do that. All of it. The whole room." "All right," she said. "And I think—" He stopped. He looked at her with the fully open expression, the one that had no armor left in it at all, the one that had been arriving in pieces since July, and was now simply permanently, entirely there. I think we should stop sleeping at opposite ends of the hall. The hallway was very still. That's not a declaration either, Eleanor said. No, he said. It's a practical suggestion. She looked at him for a moment, at the almost not quite expression that was closer to actual warmth than anything she'd seen from him when this started, at the man who had learned to laugh again by accident, and then on purpose, who had put down 4 years of holding a line and was standing in his own hallway in December, holding her hand and making practical suggestions that were not practical suggestions. All right, she said. I'll have Mrs. Greer arrange it. Eleanor, he said. Yes. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said things that mattered, plainly, without performance, with the full weight of someone who had been working toward precision and had finally found the right word. I don't have a more complicated way to say it. That's what it is. She looked at him. She thought about the girl who had stood at a kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and told herself she would not cry. She thought about the tea she'd poured without being asked, and the honest answer she'd given to an honest question, and the drive north with the questions at the inn, and every ordinary day that had been quietly, steadily building into something no one had promised her, and no arrangement had guaranteed, and no fairy tale had quite described, because fairy tales required grand gestures, and this had been built from small true things, from tea and accounts and honest letters, and a hand held in a rainstorm, and the gradual, undeniable accumulation of being known. I know, she said. I've known for a while. How long? She considered it honestly. The Northfield drainage meeting, she said. When you said do what she says. He stared at her. That was September. Yes. That was... He stopped. You knew in September. I told you I pay attention, she said. He looked at her with the expression that was, she had come to understand Nathaniel Ashcroft's version of joy. Not effusive, not performed, but deep and quiet and completely real. The kind of joy that didn't need to announce itself because it was too sure of itself to require witnesses. I love you, she said. She said it plainly the same way he had, because plainness was what they'd always given each other, and she wasn't going to dress it up now. I love this place. I love the work. I love Mrs. Greer and Harker, and the way the Northfield looks at first light, and the tenant leases in the third drawer, and the tea at midnight. She paused. And I love you. In among all of it, thoroughly and without reservation. He pulled her toward him. He held her the way he'd held her arm in the rain, with conviction, with intention, with the specific certainty of someone who has decided and is done deliberating. She let herself be held, which was not something she had a great deal of practice at, and which felt she was finding less like vulnerability than like arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing the destination. Good, he said against her hair. That's... He paused. Good. She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh, but it came full and unmanaged, and she felt him laugh too, not the brief startled sound from September, but something fuller, the laugh of a man who had found his way back to the version of himself that could. Spring came to Ashcroft Manor the following year, with the particular generosity of a season that follows a hard winter, early and warm and certain, the kind of spring that felt like an argument being won. The southeast parcel drainage went in. Harker supervised. Eleanor reviewed the costs against her projections weekly, and the projections held, and Harker stopped pretending that didn't impress him. The tenant agreements across all parcels were clean and current and fair, and the tenants, Colby and the Drummond brothers and Parrish and the rest, worked their land with the specific energy of people who had stopped bracing for injustice and could put that energy somewhere useful instead. Caroline wrote from Hartford, with the news that she was expecting a child in August, and that Jeffrey was attentive in ways I did not know to require before, but intend to keep. Eleanor wrote back with warmth that was not managed, and questions that were genuine, and the particular joy of someone who had stopped keeping score. Rebecca wrote from Albany, where she had found herself at the center of a small but serious circle of people who argued about things worth arguing about, and she was, in her own words, insufferable and entirely satisfied, which Eleanor read as the best possible outcome for Rebecca, and which Nathaniel read over her shoulder and said, "Good for her, just that." Jonathan Whitfield wrote twice over the winter. Neither letter asked for anything. Both letters were the letters of a man slowly learning a different language, the language of acknowledgement, of accountability, of something that was working toward repair, without demanding that repair be granted. Eleanor answered both. She answered honestly and without cruelty, and without pretending the hard things hadn't happened. It was enough. It was not everything. It was what it was, and she had decided somewhere in the winter months that she was done waiting for things to be everything before she let herself have them. On a morning in April, Eleanor stood at the window of the estate office with a cup of tea in her hand, strong no sugar, and looked out at the north fields, which were green with the first growth of the season, and she thought about all the small things that had accumulated into the life she was standing inside. The drainage ditches running clean along the field edges, the new barn wall facing the morning, the corrected lease agreements in the third drawer, the document room where the important things were safe, the east hallway where there were no longer two rooms at separate ends, but a life lived in the shared middle of things. Nathaniel came in behind her. He didn't announce himself, he hadn't needed to for months. She heard his step, the slight adjustment for the left leg that she had learned to read, the way she read everything fully and without looking away, and she felt him stop beside her at the window. He looked at the north fields. She looked at the north fields. The morning light was coming across them in long flat lines, the way it did in April, touching everything it reached with the specific generosity of early spring. "Harker wants to start the southeast work next week," he said. "The weather will hold," she said. "The accounts are ready." He put his hand against the small of her back. Simple, present, his. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, this is—" He stopped. Started again with the precision she loved, the careful choosing that meant he was saying the true thing, not the available thing. "This is the life I wanted when I didn't know how to want anything." She turned to look at him. She looked at him the way she had always looked at things that mattered completely, without flinching, with the full attention she had spent 20 years deploying in rooms where no one thought to deploy it back. "Yes," she said. "It is." She turned back to the window. He stood beside her. The north fields ran green and straight to the tree line, and the river moved along the northern edge of the property. Theirs finally entirely, and Ashcroft Manor breathed around them with the steady particular warmth of a place that had been waiting a long time to be this alive. She had poured a cup of tea 8 months ago without being asked for a man she hadn't known in a room where she was not supposed to matter. She had changed everything by doing the one thing she had always done, paying attention, telling the truth, and quietly, stubbornly, without asking anyone's permission, refusing to be less than she was. That was how the greatest love stories were built, not with grand gestures or perfect timing, or the approval of anyone watching, but with two people who chose each other in the small, ordinary moments again and again, until choosing became the most natural thing in the world, and the quiet life they built together turned out to be the only kind worth having.